Introduction. Human interest in the nature of consciousness dates far back to our ancestral past. However, it is only in the last century or so that researchers and philosophers have been able to tackle the problem in a more scientific way. This is primarily due to our increasing understanding of human physiology and how our brain functions. With the advent of ever more sophisticated technology, from fMRI scans, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to DARPA's neural engineering program, Understanding Neural Dust, we are now able to not only create vivid simulations of cerebral activity, but also to systematically reverse engineer the brain. Whether such empirical observations will unlock the secrets of self-reflective awareness is still open to vigorous debate. Nevertheless, the study of consciousness is now considered to be of elemental importance and has invited a large number of brilliant thinkers from a wide range of disciplines, including mathematicians, quantum physicists, neuroscientists, and philosophers, to join in the discussions and offer their own contributions. The following essays briefly explore the life and work of pioneers in the field of consciousness studies. Included in this eclectic mix are such notables as Giulio Tononi, University of Wisconsin, Paul and Patricia Churchland, University of California, San Diego, Noam Chomsky, MIT, the late Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna, and Jean-Pierre Changeux, Collège de France, among others. Daniel Dennett, by Captoria Frizzell. Daniel Clement Dennett III is an American philosopher, writer, and cognitive scientist whose research centers around the philosophy of the mind, the philosophy of science, and the philosophy of biology. He was born March 28, 1942, in Boston, Massachusetts. He spent the beginning part of his life in Lebanon during World War II because his father, Daniel Clement Dennett Jr., was a secret agent for the Office of Strategic Services. At the age of 5, his mother, Ruth Marjorie, took him back to Massachusetts because his father died in an unexplained plane crash. He was introduced to the notion of philosophy at the age of 11 by a summer camp counselor. In 1959, he graduated from the Exeter Academy. In 1963, he received his Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy at Harvard University. In 1965, he received his Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. He is heavily influenced by Charles Darwin, Richard Dawkins, David Hume, Gilbert Ryle, and W.V.O. Quine. He is an atheist and a secularist. His main interests are free will, which is the ability to choose between different possible courses of action unimpeded, philosophy of religion, which is the examination of concepts involved in religious traditions and central themes of religion, cognitive science, which is the study of the mind and its processes, and the philosophy of the mind, which is a branch of philosophy that studies the ontology and nature of the mind and its relationship with the body. He has received numerous prizes, such as the Jean Nicou Prize, 2001, Mind and Brain Prize, 2011, and the Erasmus Prize, 2012. As of 2017, he is the co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies and the Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University. He is a member of the editorial board of the Rutherford Journals. In 2004, he was named Humanist of the Year by the American Humanist Association. He is part of several fellowships, such as the Fulbright Fellowship and Guggenheim Fellowship, and has become famous as one of the 4 horsemen of atheism, along with the late Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris. He is currently married to Susan Bell, has 2 children and 5 grandchildren, and is an avid sailor. One of his most intriguing ideas is known as greedy reductionism. Greedy reductionism, according to Daniel Dennett in his 1995 book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, is a kind of erroneous reductionism, which doesn't provide much useful information. Whereas good reductionism means explaining a thing in terms of what it reduces to systematically and accurately, thereby providing a rich composite of information. Greedy reductionism occurs when, in their eagerness for a bargain, in their zeal to explain too much too fast, scientists and philosophers underestimate the complexities. trying to skip whole layers or levels of theory in their rush to fasten everything securely and neatly to the foundation. He was heavily critical of B.F. Skinner's idea of behaviorism and stated that Skinner wanted to explain the concept in the simplest of terms, cheap reductionism, without defining the more complex and important aspects of human thought and decision-making. Expensive, useful reductionism. Another one of his key ideas focuses on the concept of free will. On giving libertarians what they say they want, Chapter 15 of his 1978 book Brainstorms, Dennett articulated the case for a two-stage model of decision-making in contrast to libertarian views by stating, "The model of decision-making I am proposing has the following feature. When we are faced with an important decision, a consideration generator, whose output is to some degree undetermined, produces a series of considerations, some of which may of course be immediately rejected as irrelevant by the agent, consciously or unconsciously. Those considerations that are then selected by the agent as having a more than negligible bearing on the decision then figure in a reasoning process, and if the agent is in the main reasonable, those considerations ultimately serve as predictors and explicators of the agent's final decision." He thought that the ideas that people have when first faced to make a decision were not in their control. Those beginning ideas then become filtered out, either subconsciously or consciously, based on their relevance, in which the ideas that are not filtered out then become used to make a final decision. Dennett was heavily criticized by libertarian philosophers such as Robert Caine, whom rejected his idea of free will. Caine believed that random chance is not involved in decision-making, as that would eliminate a person's motives and reasons, character and values, and feelings and desires. Dennett's interest in the philosophy of the mind is also one of his keen interests. He believed that the problem of explaining the mind has two parts, a theory of content and a theory of consciousness. Dennett explains his views of consciousness in his book Consciousness Explained by stating, "All varieties of perception, indeed all varieties of thought or mental activity, are accomplished in the brain by parallel, multi-track processes of interpretation and elaboration of sensory inputs. Information entering the nervous system is under continuous editorial revision." He believed that consciousness has more than one layer, and that it is more than just thoughts and ideas, but emotions and feelings as well. He also believed that the content that is produced through the consciousness is automatic. These theories heavily support his theory of free will. In addition, Dennett has done a tremendous amount of research into the concept religion, and often explains it as a process of evolution. His theory is that the concept of morality is an evolutionary process and not a naturalistic fallacy, which means that the abstract idea of ethics comes from people, not a free-floating realm. He noted that clerics will continue to work in clergy positions even though they are atheists. They refuse to step away from their work due to fear of losing their jobs or not wanting to lose the benefits they have acquired. There is more information about his research in his book Caught in the Pulpit, Leaving Belief Behind, in which he co-authored with Linda LaScala. Dennett is not a supporter of artificial intelligence and believes that it is a danger to humans because humans have the potential to misunderstand AI's purpose and become slaves to its power. For further reading, Freedom Evolves, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. From Bacteria to Bach and Back. Thomas Nagel, by Una Shing. Born in July 4, 1937, Thomas Nagel is a world-renowned philosopher. Nagel has greatly contributed to our understanding of the mind and consciousness. He has published over 100 articles and books, spending the majority of his time educating the general public and students on different areas in philosophy through his writings and his public lectures. Today, he is a professor at New York University, specializing in philosophy of the mind, political philosophy, ethics, and the philosophy of science. Nagel was raised in a humble family. He was born in Belgrade, Serbia. Nagel is the only son of Carolyn and Walter Nagel, who were German Jewish refugees. As a result, he regards himself as Jewish. Nagel married Doris Bloom in 1954, but divorced in 1937. He then married Anne Hollander, but she died in 2014. In 1958, he received his first degree in philosophy from Cornell University. After that, he attended the University of Oxford with a full scholarship in 1960. Later, he studied political philosophy under John Rawls, one of the most influential philosophers at that time, and graduated from Harvard with a PhD in 1963. After graduating, Nagel has taught at UC Berkeley and Princeton University. He has inspired and taught several influential philosophers such as Susan Wolf, Shelley Kagan, and Samuel Scheffler. To this day, he is still utilizing his knowledge in philosophy and continues to inspire future generations. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and British Academy. In 2006, he was elected as a member of the American Philosophical Society. He is also a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Science Foundation. Nagel opposes the idea of reductionism. Nagel believes that psychological phenomena cannot be reduced into physics and chemistry. His famous essay, What It Is Like to Be a Bat, argues against the reductionist viewpoints. We know that bats will produce high-frequency voices. We know that bats can locate themselves and objects through echolocation. These are the ways bats feel the world. It is widely different from how humans live and interact. Humans can never experience echolocation like bats. Humans can never fly like a bat. As a result, our imagination is limited. We never know what other people have gone through because we are not them. Consciousness is not something that can be described objectively through theories. So, what is it like to be a bat? You never know because you are not a bat. The same holds true for any third-person description, since it never gets inside the first-person narrative. We can only know our own subjectivity, not another person's. To further argue against physicalism, Nagel published his controversial critique, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Concept of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Nagel opposes the materialist view of the emergence of life and consciousness. He proposes that emergence of life may be teleological instead of Darwinian natural selection and chance. Nagel points out that beginning in the 17th century, the physical science has explained a lot of elements in the universe. As a result, many scientists will suggest that humans, as a part of the universe made up by these elements, can also be explained through physics and math. Nagel does not agree with this correlation. He agrees that physical science can unquestionably describe certain physical parts of what it is to be human, but not everything. Since the evolution of living creatures contains consciousness, Darwin's theory, based on physical sciences, will come up short. As a result, consciousness cannot be fully understood based on physical sciences. In addition, Nagel has also discussed the reasons behind altruistic actions. In 1970, Nagel published The Possibility of Altruism. He defends the idea that only rational causes are acceptable, and only subjective causes that arise from rational causes are valid. He defends the concept of human nature and ethics, stating that altruism is included among the basic rational requirements of desire and action. Nagel has greatly contributed to the knowledge and philosophy of mind. To acknowledge his outstanding effort, he was awarded a Rolf Schock Prize for his contribution in philosophy. He then received the Balkan Prize Award for his outstanding achievements in the fields of humanities. He also received the honorary degree of Doctor of Letters from the University of Oxford. For further reading, Mind and Cosmos. Other Minds. Secular Philosophy. Giulio Tononi by Rania Serena Sotirto. One of the most distinguished leaders in the field of consciousness studies today is Giulio Tononi, a researcher and scientist. Tononi was born in Trento, a city in the Trentino Alto Adige region of northern Italy. An established neuroscientist and psychiatrist, Tononi holds a distinguished chair in consciousness science at the University of Wisconsin. Tononi served as a medical officer in the Army before he received his postgraduate doctoral degree in neurobiology from Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, Italy. As a scientist, Tononi specializes in the study of consciousness and its disorders, in particular, the mechanism and functions of sleep in the human mind and body. His studies have proven that sleep is beneficial for brain restoration. Currently, Tononi is most famous for his Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, which is a comprehensive theory on the nature of consciousness and the way it emerges from the complex networks within one's brain. The theory has been highly influential since it can be scientifically tested. In 2004, Tononi published a research article titled An Information Integration Theory of Consciousness. This was the first time he proposed the idea of integrated information theory. He theorized that consciousness has to do with the capacity of a system to integrate information. With the subjective experience of consciousness, IIT involves the positioning of the physical attributes necessary for a system to realize consciousness. According to IIT, consciousness requires a group of elements in a system that results in a physical cause and effect. In accordance with this theory, if the brain does not produce or possess the necessary elements, then it would not be able to generate consciousness. In general, Tononi argues in his article that subjective experience is the same as a system's capacity to integrate information. Tononi points out that any physical system has subjective components, regardless of how that system is constructed, which implies that it is possible to create machines with a sense of consciousness. In accordance with IIT, Tononi has developed a mathematical formula to measure consciousness as a quantity. He asserts that information integration can be considered as a quantity or a unit, similar to how people understand mass and energy. On the research of sleep, Tononi has hypothesized that sleep serves to renormalize synaptic strength, which counterbalances the net increase of synaptic strength that occurs when a person is awake. With Dr. Chiara Sorelli, Tononi discovered that synaptic strength in the brain increases during moments of wakefulness and decreases during sleep. Studies in humans show the slow waves that occur in the brain during sleep are critical for brain restoration and performance enhancements, solidifying the importance of sleep for one's health and well-being. Through an experiment on rats, Tononi and his group discovered that a lack of sleep can affect an individual's memory, attention span, and the ability to perform simple tasks. Tononi deduced that sleep might not only be a state of inactivity, but might be a process to initiate or activate certain cellular functions needed by the body. Through experimentation, it was found that there are specific genes present during moments of wakefulness that differs from genes that are present when one is asleep. The genes associated with being awake include mitochondrial genes that are responsible for metabolism, memory, and stress response. Meanwhile, sleep-related genes are more involved in the process of consolidating memories and protein synthesis. Sleep is therefore necessary to achieve synaptic homeostasis. Tononi's hypothesis is influential in understanding sleep deprivation and for developing medication to help people with sleeping disorders. In 2010, Tononi and Yuval Nir released a research article through the Department of Psychiatry, University of Wisconsin-Madison, called Dreaming and the Brain: From Phenomenology to Neurophysiology. The research argues that dream consciousness is similar to waking consciousness. As dreams reflect an individual's character and desires, an analysis has revealed that there is a correlation between mood, imagination, interests, and concerns when a person is awake and asleep. At the end of the article, Tononi concludes that the neurophysiology of REM sleep offers a critical beginning to understand dream phenomenology with underlying brain activity. Based on the results of his research, Tononi asserts that dreams should be viewed as a powerful form of an individual's imagination, an act that can only be done when one is conscious. When dreams are viewed in this fashion, then it could help explain the unique features of dreams, such as sudden transitions, unclear images, and the disconnection that people face from external surroundings when they are dreaming, which would be paramount for future studies. As a leading figure in the study of sleep, Tononi and his colleagues have pioneered a number of approaches to the study of sleep, which includes genomics and using rodent models by employing multi-unit or local field potential recordings in animals. He also used large-scale computer models to study the conditions of sleep and wakefulness and implement high-density EEG recordings and transcranial magnetic stimulations in humans. In addition to publishing various research articles, Tononi has also written a number of books, which include Galileo il Fotodiodo and PHI, A Voyage from the Brain to the Soul, and The Neurology of Consciousness, Cognitive Neuroscience and Neuropathology, which he wrote in collaboration with Stephen Lauries, a Belgian neurologist who is recognized worldwide as a leading clinician and researcher in the neurology of consciousness. Tononi has also co-authored a book on the field of consciousness studies with Gerald Edelman, an American biologist who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology of Medicine in 1972. For his significant contributions in the study of sleep, Tononi was awarded the NH Director's Pioneer Award in 2005 and the Harvard Medical School's Farrell Prize in Sleep Medicine in 2017. Currently, Tononi holds the David P. White Chair in Sleep Medicine. For further reading, PHI, A Voyage from the Brain to the Soul, A Universe of Consciousness, Selectionism and the Brain. Gerald Edelman by Gavin Lee. Gerald Edelman was born on July 1, 1929. During his early adolescence, Edelman focused on his musical talents and trained to be a concert violinist. Despite the fact that the advancement of science wasn't his first passion, he would later pursue a career in the sciences and forever change every field he was involved with. Edelman's education consisted of an MD from the Medical School of the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD, which he would later obtain at Rockefeller University. After receiving his MD, Edelman spent some time in the U.S. Army Medical Corps as a captain. While serving, he was sent overseas and practiced general medicine in France for about 2 years. Upon his discharge and return home, he continued his education at the Rockefeller University, pursuing a PhD. During this time, he met his first mentor, Dr. Henry G. Kunkel, and began researching immunology. After graduating, Edelman decided to stay with the university and was promoted from an associate dean to a Vincent Astor Distinguished Professor. As a professor at Rockefeller University, Edelman conducted groundbreaking work into antibiotics. His research produced an accurate model of what antibodies looked like and their respective functions. Edelman's team completed a detailed structure which contained over 1,300 amino acids and allowed the team to correctly identify where antigen binding occurred. In 1972, Edelman was awarded the Nobel Prize for his pioneering work. Although Edelman's accomplishment was indeed revolutionary, he later turned his sights on the study of the human mind. Edelman didn't believe that any other branch of science, aside from neurology, could explain consciousness. Published in 1978, A Mindful Brain described Edelman's theory of consciousness, neural Darwinism. According to his theory, the neurons are affected by the growth of an individual and the experiences which occur throughout their life. Thus, no two people can have the same patterns of neurons. These neurons branch off in groups, neural maps, which tend to fire signals together, creating brain activity. Through constant use or disuse of these neurons, they become more experienced and established. Edelman describes the process as an evolution of the human mind, in which groups and patterns of neurons which provide no use are removed. Referring back to his immunology background, Edelman describes how the human body has large amounts of antibodies which at times may randomly link to a foreign substance. This is what allows the human body to create antibodies at such an extremely quick rate when it is challenged by something it has never faced before. Similarly, the brain has neurons which link with what it witnesses and creates connections, allowing the brain to recognize objects in the world with the limited information it holds. Edelman's theory of consciousness is heavily opposed to the brain acting like a computer, but oddly relies on the functions of a computer to support and describe his hypothesis. However, Edelman's belief that the human brain isn't like a computer comes from two seemingly logical arguments he makes. First, each human brain is individually wired up in such different ways that the human brain being a computer doesn't make sense. Second, reality is not something fed to the brain in an orderly fashion. Edelman believes that the brain has a unique feature known as degeneracy, making it different from a computer. Degeneracy is essentially stating that the same level of output can be reached through different processes. Edelman's unique approach when it comes to the brain is what allowed him to formulate his theory. While simultaneously accepting the comments of his critics and researching further into the subject, Edelman was capable of better understanding why this question has stumped scientists for the longest time. Edelman's answer to consciousness has even received the attention of Nobel laureate Francis Crick. While discussing Edelman's theory of consciousness, Crick once referred to Edelman's neural Darwinism as a theory which should be instead renamed Neural Edelman. Crick's idea of consciousness was different than that of Edelman, but both showed promising work on a question which still remains unanswered even to this day. The clashes of ideas from Crick and Edelman allowed for both scientists to further their own hypotheses in search of the correct answer. Edelman was a man not focused on his own economic or social status, but rather focused on benefiting society as much as he could in the short amount of time he was afforded. Edelman demonstrated this through his actions, and in particular, the institution which he founded. The Neurosciences Institute was founded in 1981 and provided a way for real science to be conducted. With one goal in mind, Edelman was able to create a haven in which scientists were able to focus on their passion instead of external factors which would otherwise affect their work. Suddenly, the bureaucracy involved with research conducted by scientists was removed, and meaningful work could be conducted. Neuroscientists, lucky enough to be part of the institute, were granted a rare opportunity in which they could explore theoretical and experimental hypotheses. Unfortunately, however, as time progressed, growing financial issues made it more and more difficult to keep the dream real. In 2012, the Neurosciences Institute was forced to vacate their complex in San Diego, and their programs were shut down. Edelman passed away on May 17, 2014. For further reading, Second Nature, Neural Darwinism, Wider Than the Sky, Noam Chomsky by Faizan Merchant. Noam Chomsky was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on December 7, 1928, to two distinguished Hebrew scholars. Growing up in the Jewish community, Chomsky was exposed to left Zionist politics at a young age. He would often visit bookstores in New York City, voraciously reading about left-wing and anarchist politics. During his adolescent years, Chomsky identified as an anarchist and wrote a paper on the spread of fascism in Spain. Chomsky attended Oak Lane Country Day School and later Central High School, where he became dissatisfied with their strict teaching methods. At the age of 16, Chomsky began studying at the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied a variety of subjects, eventually becoming interested in Arabic. His experience there made him hesitant about pursuing a career within academia, but after being introduced to theoretical linguistics by Zelig Harris, one of the fathers of structural linguistics, he reconsidered and received both his bachelor's and master's degree in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. He applied Harris's systems of language in his master's thesis titled Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew, which was later turned into a book. After receiving his master's degree, he went on to join the Harvard Society of Fellows as a junior fellow. Here, much of Chomsky's work on structural linguistics was done. In 1952, Chomsky's first academic article, Systems of Syntactic Analysis, appeared in the Journal of Symbolic Logic. Thereafter, he submitted a thesis on transformational grammar called The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory to the University of Pennsylvania, receiving a Doctor of Philosophy degree because of it in 1955. That year, he also started an associate professor position at MIT, where he began working on a mechanical translation project while teaching linguistics and philosophy. He published his first book, Syntactic Structures, in 1957. It was later considered to be one of the most revolutionary books within the scientific study of language. Chomsky continued writing a number of books on generative grammar, eventually publishing Language and Mind, a compilation of lectures he gave at the University of California, Berkeley, in 1968. He also took part in the Linguistics Wars, a number of intellectual debates on the philosophy of language itself. In the early 1960s, Chomsky joined activists in the anti-war protests of the Vietnam War, denouncing the involvement of the USA in his 1967 critique, The Responsibility of Intellectuals. As a political dissident and participant in persistent left-wing activism, he was placed on Richard Nixon's master list of political opponents. Throughout the years, Chomsky has continued to speak up about what he believes in when it comes to political matters, critiquing various decisions of the government. In 2002, Chomsky retired from MIT, focusing his efforts on social issues regarding Turkey's Kurds and the abolishment of nuclear weapons from the world. He currently teaches linguistics at the University of Arizona, a position he received in 2017. Noam Chomsky is known for a few very important theories that have become foundational within the modern fields of linguistics, psychology, and even computer science, among many others. Chomsky began his intellectual career with a review of a book called Verbal Behavior by B.F. Skinner, a behavioral psychologist. In his critique, Chomsky attacked one of the main tenets of the book, behaviorism. At the time it was written, behaviorism was a widely accepted belief which explained that human behavior, such as talking or thinking, was learned through mimicking the actions of other humans. Children were considered to be blank slates who learned directly through their environments and interactions with other human beings. Chomsky took a different stance. In his critique, he stated that there are some elements of the structure of language which are inherent to humans. He believed that through evolution and genetic inheritance, this inherent knowledge of language structure had been passed down, differing vastly from other animals and their modes of communication. This belief brought us to what we know today as Chomsky's universal grammar theory. This theory begins by maintaining the belief that children are born with an inherent sense of syntactic knowledge of language. This innate knowledge slowly unravels itself as one begins to experience human interaction within their external environment. Elements of native language blend with the innate syntactic knowledge to create the languages we speak today. Chomsky compares this feature of humans to other animals, discovering that no other animal can understand and acquire language as humans can. He goes on to conclude that humans must have a language acquisition device that no other animal possesses. Chomsky believes this to be true due to the poverty of stimulus argument. This argument states that it would be impossible for children to learn all the features of language with the small amount of data they receive when actually learning. It's then inferred that there must be some inherent information within the human mind at birth, which builds upon the external features of native languages. If we assume this, then there must be some knowledge of language that we, as humans, share within our minds. The question then becomes, what is this universal knowledge? What does it consist of? What are its limits and parameters? These questions have not been answered, and the goal is to find universal constraints and abilities of language that allow us to figure out this innate syntactic structure of language within our minds. When this goal has been achieved, we will begin to understand what universal grammar really is. In terms of the current research on consciousness, Chomsky takes a more pessimistic view on the search for a theory. He doesn't necessarily believe that researchers will be able to come up with a theory of consciousness that is completely intelligible to humans. In addition, he believes that understanding the brain technically through the neuroscience may not be the best way to go about searching for an explanation of consciousness. During a presentation Chomsky gave at the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, Arizona in 2018, he compared neuroscience to a marionette, explaining that the field is currently exploring the puppet and its strings rather than the puppeteer itself. Although he has a gloomy outlook on the future of consciousness research, Chomsky's theories within linguistics have affected the study of consciousness in a major way. Today, Chomsky spends most of his time focused on politics, but his groundbreaking work has changed the way we view the brain and its inception at birth. For further reading, Manufacturing Consent, Language and Mind, Who Rules the World? Nicholas Keynes Humphrey by Christy Lynn. Nicholas Humphrey, a neuropsychologist and theoretical psychologist, is most well known for his studies on the consciousness and behavior of primates. Through multiple research projects on animals, specifically gorillas and monkeys, Humphrey has found a great amount of information that supports his theories about the behavior and makeup of human consciousness. He is most well known for his understanding of how our intellects serve as a social function. When Humphrey is not working within the field of science, he pursues his passion for politics, is a major supporter and advocate for the anti-nuclear movement. Born on March 27, 1943, Nicholas Humphrey was raised by a big family filled with notable scientists, physiologists, and immunologists, some who have even won Nobel Prizes. His upbringing heavily influenced his passion for science, and since he was very young, he never saw himself being anything other than a scientist. In 1956, Humphrey attended Westminster School, where he was first introduced to the theory of light speed by an inspiring teacher, causing him to become interested in physics. However, after graduating from Westminster and attending Trinity College, he felt a lack of interest in physics and mathematics classes that he took in university, and instead found himself becoming more drawn to biology. Delving deeper into this emerging field, Humphrey found that biology was much easier for him to understand and dissect, so he challenged himself to conquer the most complex subject in biology, which is human consciousness. Humphrey first started his research on consciousness by studying animal behavior, and most specifically on gorillas and monkeys. At first, Humphrey based a majority of his findings and theories on the study of monkey brain cells in laboratories in Cambridge. Humphrey tackled multiple areas related to consciousness, including studying the movement of the individual nerve cells within the brain and a monkey's reactions and behavior towards visual aesthetics. After this experience, Humphrey took special notice of one particular monkey named Helen, who, after having her visual cortex removed, became blind. Humphrey developed an intimate relationship with Helen and often took her out for walks, exposed her to the environment, and had conversations with her to convince her that she can, in fact, see. Through this 7-year period, Humphrey not only developed a strong attachment to Helen, but discovered many life-changing behaviors that contributed heavily to the development of his theory. Humphrey called this blind sight, which is the ability or a previously unsuspected capacity for vision after total lesions of striate cortex, which became a famous term used by future psychologists and biologists. When Helen was put down, Humphrey was devastated, but moved on from his study of the visual cortex and began to approach the relation of consciousness to visual aesthetics. However, he realized that monkeys were not the best test subjects for this theory because they were only responsive to color, but had no interest in shapes or sounds. After studying the biological components of monkeys, fellow scientist Diane Fossey invited Humphrey to observe how sociological factors affect awareness. Agreeing to camp in the Republic of Rwanda in Central Africa, Humphrey spent 3 months at Lake Turkana studying the social behavior and life of mountain gorillas. Because of this trip, Humphrey wrote his groundbreaking essay, The Social Function of Intellect, which has been regarded as one of the fundamental works explaining evolutionary psychology. This essay was soon further developed into his very first book, titled Consciousness Regained: Chapters in the Development of Mind, which was published in 1983. In Humphrey's Consciousness Regained, one particular excerpt summarizes his interpretation of consciousness, which is under the control of an internal nervous mechanism. This mechanism is responsive to and engaged with the external environment, but at the same time operates in many ways autonomously, collating information, hatching plans, and making decisions between one course of action and another. Being internal and autonomous, it also, for the most part, operates away from other people's view. You cannot see directly into my mechanism, and I cannot see directly into yours. Yet, insofar as I am conscious, I can see as if with an inner eye into my own. After this period of fundamental research, Humphrey continued his passion for the topic of consciousness by writing multiple books, a total of 10, that explain the evolution and development of the human mind. Not only did Humphrey spread his knowledge through writing, but he also had his own Channel 4 television series called The Inner Eye that soon became its own book. Humphrey does not limit his field to only scientific research, but also expresses his opinion on politics, specifically on warfare. In 1970, Humphrey delivered a famous lecture, 4 Minutes to Midnight, and participated in the writing of In a Dark Time, with both expressing his anti-nuclear perspective. Through his activist speech and writing, Humphrey won the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize in 1984 to honor his argument about the danger and violence of atomic ammunition. To this day, Humphrey continues to branch out on topics related to human consciousness, and he is currently studying the placebo effect and proposing his new theory known as the health management system, which is a process currently being further developed to analyze the phenomena that the body develops its own medicine against certain sicknesses and diseases. By relying more on the internal health management system, Humphrey believes that this will increase or improve our overall biological fitness and be more beneficial in the long run. He continues to study and conduct his research in laboratories and gives annual lectures at UCL. For further reading, Soul Dust, Consciousness Regained, The Inner Eye. The Invention of Consciousness, an excerpt by Nicholas Humphrey. But evolution is inventive. Before long, there arises in the brain a special module, a proto-self, if you like, whose job is exactly that, to discover what the stimulation means for me. And, as luck would have it, it turns out it can do this by the simple trick of reading, extracting the meaning from, the motor command signals being sent out to produce the reflex response. So now, we have an agent who is reading the brain's own responses and making a sensory interpretation of them. In truth, this is the first subject of sensation. But let's note there is nothing fancy or magical about the interpretation at this stage. The subjective experience does not have had any special phenomenal feel. What happened? I've argued that the key lay in how sensation went on evolving. Back at the start, the reflex responses are overtly bodily actions occurring at the site of stimulation at the body surface. However, things are never going to stay like this. As the descendants of the original creatures evolve to be more sophisticated, these overt responses soon enough become inappropriate, even inconvenient. You don't always want to grimace when you're touched by red light, say. So now the creature faces a problem. How to lose the bodily behavior but keep the information about the meaning of the stimulus? The solution, natural selection, hits on this ingenious. It is for the responses to become internalized or privatized, such as the motor signals no longer reach the actual body surface, but rather begin to target the body map where the sense organs first project to the brain. Thus, sensation evolves from being an actual form of bodily expression to being a virtual one, yet still a response that the subject can milk for information. Now, this privatization has a remarkable, if fortuitous, result. It means that a feedback loop is created between motor and sensory regions of the brain, a loop that has the capacity to sustain recursive activity, going round and round, catching its own tail. And this, as I see it, is game-changing. Crucially, it means that the activity can be drawn out in time, so as to create the thick moment of sensory experience. But, more than this, the activity can be channeled and stabilized so as to create a mathematically complex attractor state. And such an attractor can have remarkable hyperdimensional properties. Real, unreal, surreal? The answer will be in the eye of the beholder, the subject whose reading of this brain activity is giving rise to the sensory experience. At any rate, from now on, whenever the opportunity arises to improve the quality of sensations, to make further adaptive changes, natural selection has a whole new design space to explore. Small adjustments to the circuitry can have dramatic effects. And this provides the evolutionary context, I believe, for the invention of a special kind of attractor that will be read by the subject as a sensation with an unaccountable phenomenal feel. On the analogy of the gorgundrum, I've called this attractor the ipsundrum to signify a real, impossible brain state that is actually self-made. The ipsundrum is still a species of sensation that originates as a response to sensory stimulation and still carries information about the objective properties of the stimulation. But this information now comes in a remarkable new guise. It comes, if you like, as part of a riddle written on the brain. I put forward this account of sensations more than 25 years ago. My arguments were largely theoretical rather than empirical, but I'm happy to say it looks as if one of the key features has been getting experimental backing. The invention of consciousness, namely, that visual sensations depend on brain activity in a loop running between primary visual cortex and areas further forward. In a masterly review of recent neuroscientific evidence, Stan Dehane, who oddly enough is something of a qualia denier, sums up the picture he sees emerging. Consciousness lives in the loops. Reverberating neuronal activity circulating in the web of our cortical connections causes our conscious experiences. So, there we have it. My glimmer of a theory of what gives consciousness its astonishing quality. With so much of the detail missing, I acknowledge it's not much more than a glimmer. But it must be better than no theory at all. Colin McGinn has written, "It is not that we know what would explain consciousness, but are having trouble finding the evidence to select one explanation over the others. Rather, we have no idea what an explanation of consciousness would even look like." I humbly suggest that's no longer true. This is all I have to say for now about how a physical system could deliver conscious experience. However, for an evolutionist, of course it's too soon to wrap up the discussion. We may have found a possible answer to the question of what evolved, but we haven't yet begun to address the question of why it evolved. Even if we did know all the detail, if we could explain how conscious experience is created neuron by neuron, from red light touching your retina through to your making all the claims you do about the red qualia, we still would not know what this is good for. What can possibly have been the biological advantage, the contribution to fitness, of dressing up sensations in this provocatively mysterious way? It's a real problem. Let's return to the idea of consciousness as an invention. Under the first meaning of invention, we saw that consciousness could indeed be considered to be a cognitive faculty evolved by natural selection, designed to help us make sense of ourselves and our surroundings. But now, when we consider the role of qualia, this meaning of invention looks much less of a good fit. At first sight, at least, qualia are neither cognitive nor helpful. Jerry Fodor has stated the difficulty in his typically blunt way. Consciousness, and it's clear he's referring to qualia in particular, seems to be among the chronically unemployed. As far as anybody knows, anything that our conscious minds can do, they could do just as well if they weren't conscious. Why then did God bother to make consciousness? John Searle has made much the same claim about qualia having no impact at the level of behavior. As far as the ontology of consciousness is concerned, behavior is simply irrelevant. We could have identical behavior in two different systems, one of which is conscious and the other totally unconscious. If these philosophers are right, it would mean that consciousness, at least its phenomenal side, could not have had any impact on our ancestors' survival, in which case the genes specifying the underlying brain circuits could not have been selected by natural selection. Then, are these philosophers right? I think the plain answer is no. They are guilty of a massive failure of imagination. Fodor says qualia are unemployed. He seems to take it for granted that if consciousness does have a job to do, this can only be to provide us with some special kind of skill, helping us to act more intelligently or more efficiently in the service of some practical goal. But what if this notion of employment is simply not appropriate when discussing the phenomenal aspect of consciousness? What if phenomenal consciousness, rather than making us more intelligent or more productive on the outside, makes us somehow bigger on the inside, emotionally and spiritually bigger? What if consciousness is actually an invention in the second sense I mentioned at the start? A fantasy conjured up by the brain designed to change how we value what becomes of us. Think about it. Think again about the real impossible triangle, the Gregundrum. Why, for what purpose, did Richard Gregory invent this brilliant illusion? There's a photo showing him with his face framed by the real impossible object. Look at his broad smile. He did it to simply amaze us. Then, could it be that nature, when she invented qualia, did it so that we conscious creatures should amaze ourselves? Don't get me wrong, I am a card-carrying Darwinian reductionist. I've no wish to get off the explanatory hook by substituting fuzzy answers for clear ones. But still, I do think there are times when, in the interest of science, we need to loosen up a bit. Before we pronounce on the employability of phenomenal consciousness, we need to undertake a proper natural history. We should be studying on how conscious experience actually changes the way people live in the world. How does exposure to qualia change people's psychology? What beliefs and attitudes are generated? How does it affect people's ideas about who and what they are, and what kind of world they live in? These are, or ought to be, empirical questions to be asked of ordinary people, and we should be ready to consider all sorts of possible answers, not just those we'd find discussed in the science or philosophy section of the library, but perhaps those that belong in the self-help section, or even the New Age. But, most important, we should begin the inquiry close to home, by taking seriously our own intentions about just how and why phenomenal consciousness matters to ourselves. Think about it. Suppose the magic for you were not there. Suppose your sensations were, in fact, just brown bag numbers. What would be missing from your life? It's clear to me that in such a semi-zombie state, you, would lose out on several levels. First, you'd lose your psychological essence, your core self. Next, you'd lose your sense of intimacy with things in the outside world. And then, finally, you'd lose your soul, and other humans would lose their souls as well. We saw early on how the binding of subselves leads to the creation of the core self as the singular subject of a range of mental states. But, now let me say it, even when all the subselves are gathered together, the larger self is by no means secure. A self stripped of sensations would remain a pretty anemic kind of self. But add in the qualia, and everything changes. By lifting sensory experience onto that mysterious, non-physical plane, qualia deepen and enrich your sense of your own presence. You find yourself living in thick time. You become the owner of a self that you want to expand and preserve for its own sake. In short, a self worth having. Take away this primary sense of your own presence, and your existence would simply be less well-founded, less convincing, to you and everyone else. Next, though this isn't so obvious, you'd lose the external world, at least the world as you've come to know and love it. Even though it's your own brain that creates the qualia, you can't but project the special qualities of sensations out onto the objects of perception in the outside world. In doing so, you spread a kind of fairy dust around you. You enchant the world. Take away this magic paintbrush, and the world would lose much of its significance. You'd find it a less awesome place, less fun, less promising. You did it. It's all yours. The things out there experienced through bodily sensation are singing your song. It's bound to dawn on you that when you pay homage to the beauties of nature, you are really paying homage to yourself. So, by a strange inversion, the magical world you've made returns the compliment and further enhances your sense of your own significance. Then add in the poetry of human culture, and by one path or another, your core self becomes elaborated into that marvelous cultural construct, the human soul. A soul that, with your generous theory of mind, you recognize in other people too. Now, I will draw this to a close. Earlier, when I quoted Shakespeare's prologue, I omitted the first lines. They read, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend, the brightest heaven of invention." The chorus means invention in the second sense. He's seeking permission for the actors to create an extraordinary work of fiction on the stage. I like to think that nature did it first. Qualia are just such an invention, arguably the brightest heaven, the most remarkable story that anyone has ever dared to tell. Thanks to natural selection, we all contain within ourselves that muse of fire. Francis Crick, by Ethan Lee. Francis Crick was born on June 8, 1916, in Northampton, England. He attended the Northampton Grammar School and Mill Hill School in London, and then the University College London, where he began his studies in physics. Crick graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in 1937, then later conducted his PhD research in 1939, only to be stopped by the breakout of World War II. Crick was highly involved during the war, developing magnetic and acoustic mines, but soon after began to study biology, which at first he knew very little of. He resumed his studies at Cambridge University, working at the Strangeways Research Laboratory, then later Cavendish Laboratory in 1949. In 1951, he met a young biologist, James Watson, who they would together discover the double helix structure of DNA. Francis Crick finally received his PhD from Cambridge's Gonville and Caius College in 1954. Crick and Watson were both co-awarded, along with Maurice Wilkins, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1962. As groundbreaking as his contributions to biological science are, Crick had developed his own theories on human consciousness that provided an enlightening perspective on the structure and neurobiology of the brain. In 1994, Crick published The Astonishing Hypothesis, in which he described his ideas about consciousness. In this work, it covers the rudimentary necessities required to study consciousness itself while providing an overarching analysis of how awareness arises within a societal context. Instead of delving into the generalities of human consciousness and its various manifestations, Crick focused on visual systems and dissected the prerequisites required for awareness to exist and experience differing events, thoughts, perceptions, etc., within the brain. While discussing visual systems, he suggests that future experimentation is required to provide holistically gathered and empirical data for furthering the understanding of the human consciousness. such as the testing of free will. Following a reductionist paradigm, Francis Crick believed that the key to understanding human consciousness was through the research and understanding of neural functions, both individually and in tandem when neural systems are working together. Synapses, dendrites, axons, etc. The first step is through the understanding of how the brain interprets visual stimulation and how the brain gathers information about the events around it. This begs the question of where consciousness is located. So, Crick states that one must also determine what is responsible for determining the location of consciousness itself. He agrees with the notion that consciousness may be clustered throughout regions of the brain, whether that be a single unifying region or multiple, versus the notion that consciousness is ingrained in every cell of the body. After a discovery of the location of the cells that dictate consciousness, theoretically speaking, one can then determine what events, objects, or thoughts are relegated to the subconscious, a task seemingly impossible without the proper understanding of one condition or the other. Crick writes that singular cells cannot dictate responsibility of recognizing objects or events, for there are more objects in the world than cells in the human brain. Therefore, because of the aforementioned theory that cells must be working together to create consciousness, cells must be working in tandem to recognize and cognitively identify objects or events. This is because there are almost an infinite, and therefore sufficient, amount of combinations by which cells can create in the brain to perceive different objects or events that an individual can encounter. The problem that arises is known as the binding problem, which is identifying what specific cells are working together to recognize objects and when they are co-functioning. Francis Crick was a strident atheist, believing that scientific research and understanding removed the necessity for religious doctrine that provided explanations of natural phenomena, which at first seemed unexplainable to humans. Just like his discovery of DNA, this work takes time, and at first seems too daunting of a task to tackle. Through the bettering of technology and scientific inventions, Crick believed that humans will eventually uncover what drives human consciousness. The first step is in precisely discovering the locality of human consciousness. For further reading, The Astonishing Hypothesis of Molecules and Men, Life Itself. A Review of the Astonishing Hypothesis by David Christopher Lane. This book review was first published in the University of California magazine commemorating Francis Crick, circa 1995. Francis Crick is a charming and disarming man, with a good sense of humor and a quick, ironic wit. It is these very same traits which make reading The Astonishing Hypothesis such a joy to read. Although there has been something of a publishing bonanza in books dealing with the brain-mind-computer connection, they have, with a few exceptions, been weighted down by cumbersome reasoning, especially works trying to connect quantum theory with mysticism. Such is not the case with Crick's latest tome, since he argues with clarity, focus, and ease. His hypothesis, astonishing or not, is really quite simple. Man has no soul, no spiritual self which transcends his or her physical frame. What we take to be the soul, Crick argues, is nothing more than a complex network of neurons. We are to the very core physical beings who have somehow deceived ourselves into believing that we are something more, something non-material, something transcendent. That is the prejudice, of course, which Crick is trying to overcome by gallantly stating that science should explore the question of consciousness with as much dedication as we have the sky, the atom, and the evolution of life. And what Crick thinks we will eventually discover is a physical basis for consciousness, something which resides in the parallel processing of a vast neural internet. As Crick so astutely puts it, the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you are nothing but a pack of neurons. This hypothesis is so alien to the ideas of most people alive today that it can be truly called astonishing. Now, on the surface of it, Crick's argument seems so obvious as not to be very astonishing at all, especially when we realize that every great discovery in science has been grounded, so to say, in some simpler material structure. Cells turned out to be cast from molecules, molecules from atoms, atoms from electrons, protons, and neutrons. Even questions as profound as "what is life?" also the title of a highly influential book by the famed physicist Erwin Schrödinger, which plagued biologists during the early and mid-part of this century, turned out to have a physical, if minute, answer: the DNA molecule. Yet many thought the answer would never be found because life was something vitalistic, something non-material, something science could not identify. As it turns out, though, every endeavor to locate the secrets of the universe hinge on focusing first and foremost on the empirical realm. As Crick sees it, why shouldn't consciousness have a physical basis? Hearing does. Seeing does. Why not being as well? To Crick's credit, and unlike that of Daniel Dennett's overhyped and underdocumented Consciousness Explained, he does not claim to have the final answer to the mystery of awareness. Rather, he wants to posit a well-thought-out blueprint on how neurons could produce something as unlikely as self-reflective consciousness. Crick does this by centering on how we see things, since vision is such an elemental part of most individuals' day-to-day world. As Crick explains, the mental picture that most of us have is that there is a little man or woman somewhere inside our brain who is following, or at least trying hard to follow, what is going on. I shall call this the fallacy of the homunculus. Homunculus is Latin for little man. Many people do indeed feel this way, and that fact, in due course, will itself need an explanation. But our astonishing hypothesis states that this is not the case. Loosely speaking, it says that it's all done by neurons. Crick isn't simply being glib when he says that neurons are the basic unit by which we should understand the profound display of awareness. Keep in mind, it was this very sort of radical reductionism which led to the discovery of the double helix molecule. Without such a positivistic empirical approach, there wouldn't be a genome project, much less the amazing discoveries, almost monthly, of how and where certain diseases are located and copied in our genetic code. To be sure, Crick is a thoroughly materialistic scientist, always grounding his insights in the observable world. But shouldn't we all be, to some extent, given the wonderful successes of just such a posture? True, we may not like the implications of Crick's hypothesis. As Patricia Churchland so exquisitely sums it, we are simply 3 pounds of glorious meat, wonder tissue. But can we escape its factual elegance? Even now, as I type these lines on the computer, if I close my eyes just for a second, the whole visual world collapses into darkness. Why? A very thin layer of skin, my eyelids, have sealed off the infusing light so that my eye, no pun intended, can no longer transfigure the incoming data. I have gone blind temporarily, not because of karma, not because of some sort of sin, not because of God intervening, but because of a very ordinary physical happening. I blinked. If blinking can cause the bright universe to go dark, is it really such a stretch of our imagination to believe that consciousness is the outcome of chemical electrical processes in the brain? I think not. Indeed, it takes a much greater investment in faith to believe that I am something more than neurons firing. Crick even has the audacity to claim that he might have discovered where free will is located in the brain. My first assumption was that part of one's brain is concerned with making plans for future actions, without necessarily carrying them out. I also assumed that one can be conscious of such plans, that is, that they are subject to at least immediate recall. My second assumption was that one is not conscious of the computations done by this part of the brain, but only of the decisions it makes, that is, its plans. Of course, these computations will depend on the structure of that part of the brain, derived epigenetically and partly from past experience, and on its current inputs from other parts of the brain. My third assumption was that the decision to act on one plan or another is also subject to the same limitations. In other words, one has immediate recall of what is decided, but not of the computations that went into the decision, even though one may be aware of a plan to move. Then, such a machine, this was the word I used in my letter, will appear to itself to have free will, provided it can personify its behavior. That is, it has an image of itself. The actual cause of the decision may be clear-cut, Patricia Churchland's edition, or it may be deterministic but chaotic. That is, a very small perturbation may make a big difference to the end result. This would give the appearance of the will being free, since it would make the outcome essentially unpredictable. Such a machine can attempt to explain to itself why it made a certain choice by using introspection. Sometimes it may reach the correct conclusion. At other times, it will either not know or, more likely, will confabulate because it has no conscious knowledge of the reason for the choice. This implies that there must be a mechanism for confabulation, meaning that given a certain amount of evidence, which may or may not be misleading, part of the brain will jump to the simplest conclusion. As we have seen, this can happen all too easily. Free will, it appears, is located in or near the anterior cingulate sulcus. Crick may turn out to be wrong in the details of his theory. If God resides in the details, as the popular saying goes, so does our understanding of awareness. But I think he's right on the mark to focus our aim in the direction of the neural pathways of the brain. If we do not follow such a materialist paradigm to understand consciousness, we may be then left with the likes of Shirley and crew telling us to find our true selves, along with Elvis presumably, in the higher astral worlds, no doubt at the added expense of having to attend some New Age seminar first to get the correct directions. On the other hand, the scientific search for the soul, according to Crick, will end up not finding one, but will instead reveal that we are, in sum, nothing more and nothing less than neural surfers riding stimulus waves in the cerebral hemispheres. As a surfer myself of ocean waves, I think Crick will eventually be proven correct. Note: not surprisingly, the only major objection I have with Crick's book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, is his section, albeit brief, on animal testing. Writes Crick, even if new methods are devised so that much better neuroanatomy can be done on humans, there are still many key experiments that can only be performed on animals. Most of these experiments produce little, if any, pain, but when they are over, in some cases they may last for months, it is usually necessary to sacrifice the animal, again quite painlessly. The animal rights movement is surely correct in insisting that animals be treated humanely, and as a result of their efforts, animals in laboratories are now looked after somewhat better than they were in the past. But it is sentimental to idealize animals. The life of an animal in the wild, whether carnivore or herbivore, is often brutal and short compared to its life in captivity. Nor is it reasonable to claim that since both animals and humans are part of nature, that they should be entitled to exactly equal treatment. Does a gorilla really deserve a university education? It demeans our unique human capabilities to insist that animals should be treated precisely the same way as human beings. They should be certainly handled humanely, but it shows a distorted sense of values to put them on the same level as humans. Here, Crick's reasoning is not only fallacious. Granting a gorilla entrance rights to the University of California is one thing, killing him or her is quite another, but ethnocentric to the extreme. If, as Crick argues, we are nothing more than sophisticated neural chemistry, then how many neurons does an animal need in order to have its life not terminated for scientific research? 100,000? 1 million? Crick's argument is inane, especially when we consider that our DNA code is almost identical, 99%, to that of chimpanzees. Sorry about that, cheetah, but you're 1% shy on the genetic test. Off to the death camps for you. Our use of the word laboratory, from the living perspective of the animal, is simply a euphemism for incarceration, occasional torture, and death. I would love to see how Crick would plead his case to a species, exobiological in origin presumably, which had a more developed brain than himself. He probably couldn't communicate to them, though, since they most likely would not understand his primitive cries. Poor human, not enough neurons. Off to the laboratory for him. Aldous Huxley by Denise Modis. Among the many dystopian novels written throughout the 20th century, Brave New World is a classic that sits atop with other literary works such as George Orwell's 1984 and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Who exactly was the mind that imagined a futuristic society in which citizens are genetically engineered to feel no pain, psychologically manipulated, and routinely drugged to uphold an authoritarian ruling order? His name was Aldous Huxley. Aldous Leonard Huxley was an English literary writer born on July 26, 1894, in Godalming, Surrey, England. One could say that he already had a penchant for literature and science ever since he was born into a prominent intellectual family, the Huxley family, who were known for their contributions to the sciences, arts, and literature. The Huxleys' rise to prominence began with Thomas Henry Huxley, Aldous's grandfather, who was a biologist and anthropologist. He became known as Darwin's bulldog for his unyielding support of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Aldous Huxley was different. He was nobody's dog and explored life to his heart's content. In his early 20s, Huxley became an established writer and social satirist. Brave New World ironically started out as a parody of fellow science fiction writer and colleague H.G. Wells' utopian novel Men Like Gods, and several more like it. Huxley tried to marry science and literature. He believed that it is crucial to be intellectual in different bodies of knowledge. The compelling writer used concepts of science as themes and settings for his novels, while he used literature to critique the anomalies of scientific advancements. With his profound familial ties with science and his dream of becoming a doctor, how did young Aldous become a writer and philosopher instead? At the age of 16, Huxley suffered from a disease that temporarily blinded his eyes. He had plans to enter the medical profession, but found that his condition would negatively impact any future in medicine. In Balliol College, Oxford, he took up English literature instead. He loved reading so much that he resorted to using a large magnifying glass, and sometimes others would read aloud to him. His eye problems also made him ineligible to serve in the military during World War I, although if he had gone off to war, he could have been one of the nearly 700,000 British soldiers who lost their lives between 1914 and 1918. After graduating from college and becoming a relatively established writer, he briefly taught French at Eton College, where he had Eric Blair, who would later use the pen name George Orwell, as one of his students. Blair would then go on to write a classic of his own, namely 1984, a dystopian novel about a middle-aged man living in an oppressive totalitarian rule led by Big Brother. Huxley sprinkled his novels with how he viewed society, such as in Chrome Yellow, Point Counterpoint, Brave New World, and Eyeglass in Gaza. For instance, the factory setting in which genetically engineered babies were produced was inspired from the assembly lines in Henry Ford's manufacturing plant. While he did not necessarily condemn it, he was highly critical of the capitalist American culture he witnessed. Whereas his works of fiction defined his writing career, his essays contained the crux of his philosophy. While not as revered as his earlier novels, his essay collections, which include The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, showcased his unfiltered insights on such topics as drugs, religion, psychology, war, science, and technology. In The Doors of Perception, Huxley takes the reader with him through his psychedelic experiences. Native Americans regarded a certain cactus, called peyote, as a gift from the divine spirits, thus using the plant for religious ceremonies. Mescaline is the principal active psychedelic agent of peyote. After reading up on psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond's academic paper on mescaline, Huxley eagerly called him up to submit himself as a guinea pig to test out the psychedelic. On the day of the experiment, he ingested 0.4 of a gram of mescaline dissolved in water. His account of the experiences while under the influence was recorded on a dictating machine, allowing himself to refresh his memory of what had happened. Reflecting back on his experience, Huxley suggested that each person is capable of remembering and perceiving everything that is happening. However, the brain and the nervous system protect the person from being overwhelmed by shutting out most of what is going on in the surroundings and funnels in only what may be practically useful. What will be left would then be the consciousness that keeps only biological survival possible. When taking mescaline, the intellect remains intact and the perception is greatly enhanced, but the will takes a turn for the worse. Level-headed individuals typically would repeatedly think and sometimes overthink of ways on how to go about to do something, especially in situations that could profoundly affect their circumstance. Mescaline takers do not see any good reason to care that much for such trivial things. Huxley introduced the concept of mind at large to describe reaching into the consciousness once the filters that the brain and the ego provide are expelled. He declared that the urge to transcend self-conscious selfhood is a principal appetite of the soul. When individuals fail to transcend self-consciousness, whether it is by means of worship, good deeds, or medication, then they are more inclined to resort to chemical substances, such as alcohol and drugs. Ideally, religion should fulfill self-transcendence for everyone, but since this is not the case, anyone should be given the opportunity to partake in activities, i.e., taking psychedelics, that could help them get to the mind at large. The mescaline experiment with Osmond was only the start of his appreciation for hallucinogenic drugs. He continued to study and share his experiences with them for the next decade. On November 22, 1963, he died in his Los Angeles home on the same day that his fellow English writer C.S. Lewis, author of The Chronicles of Narnia, died. Their deaths may have been overshadowed by the assassination of President John F. Kennedy just hours later. Still, Huxley managed to do something remarkable on his deathbed. He asked second wife, Laura Arcara Huxley, to administer a dose of LSD to him, and so she did. Despite having partial blindness, Aldous Huxley truly had a colorful life. His life escaped his frail, diseased body, and LSD ran rampant through his system. He probably saw colors so bright and so intense, it took him back to his first glimpse of the mind at large. For further reading, The Doors of Perception, Island, The Perennial Philosophy. Selected excerpts of an interview with Aldous Huxley by the Paris Review. Interviewers: Do you see any relation between the creative process and the use of such drugs as lysergic acid diethylamide? Huxley: I don't think there is any generalization one can make on this. Experience has shown that there is an enormous variation in the way people respond to lysergic acid. Some people probably could get direct aesthetic inspiration for painting or poetry out of it. Others, I don't think could. For most people, it's an extremely significant experience, and I suppose in an indirect way, it could help the creative process. But I don't think one can sit down and say, I want to write a magnificent poem, and so I'm going to take lysergic acid diethylamide. I don't think it's by any means certain that you would get the result you wanted. You might get almost any result. Interviewers: Would the drug give more help to the lyric poet than the novelist? Huxley: Well, the poet would certainly get an extraordinary view of life which he wouldn't have had in any other way, and this might help him a great deal. But you see, and this is the most significant thing about the experience, during the experience, you're really not interested in doing anything practical, even writing lyric poetry. If you were having a love affair with a woman, would you be interested in writing about it? Of course not. And during the experience, you're not particularly in words, because the experience transcends words and is quite inexpressible in terms of words. So the whole notion of conceptualizing what is happening seems very silly. After the event, it seems to me quite possible that it might be of great assistance. People would see the universe around them in a very different way and would be inspired, possibly, to write about it. Interviewers: But is there much carryover from the experience? Huxley: Well, there's always a complete memory of the experience. You remember something extraordinary having happened, and to some extent, you can relive the experience, particularly the transformation of the outside world. You get hints of this. You see the world in this transfigured way now and then, not to the same pitch of intensity, but something of the kind. And it does help you to look at the world in a new way, and you come to understand very clearly the way that certain specifically gifted people have seen the world. You are actually introduced into the kind of world that Van Gogh lived in, or the kind of world that Blake lived in. You begin to have a direct experience of this kind of world while you're under the drug, and afterwards you can remember, and to some slight extent recapture this kind of world, which certain privileged people have moved in and out of, as Blake obviously did all the time. Interviewers: But the artist's talents won't be any different from what they were before he took the drug? Huxley: I don't see why they should be different. Some experiments have been made to see what painters can do under the influence of the drug, but most of the examples I have seen are very uninteresting. You could never hope to reproduce to the full extent the quite incredible intensity of color that you get under the influence of the drug. Most of the things I have seen are just rather tiresome bits of expressionism, which correspond hardly at all, I would think, to the actual experience. Maybe an immensely gifted artist, someone like Odilon Radon, who probably saw the world like this all the time anyhow, maybe such a man could profit by the lysergic acid diethylamide experience, could use his visions as models, could reproduce on canvas the external world as it is transfigured by the drug. Interviewers: Here this afternoon, as in your book, The Doors of Perception, you've been talking chiefly about the visual experience under the drug and about painting. Is there any similar gain in psychological insight? Huxley: Yes, I think there is. While one is under the drug, one has penetrating insights into the people around one, and also into one's own life. Many people get tremendous recalls of buried material. A process which may take 6 years of psychoanalysis happens in an hour, and considerably cheaper. And the experience can be very liberating and widening in other ways. It shows that the world one habitually lives in is merely a creation of this conventional, closely conditioned being which one is, and that there are quite other kinds of worlds outside. It is a very salutary thing to realize that the rather dull universe in which most of us spend most of our time is not the only universe there is. I think it's healthy that people should have this experience. Jean-Pierre Changeux. Jean-Pierre Changeux is one of the fathers of modern neurobiology. His primary studies are on isolated acetylcholine receptors, specifically in the electric organs of some fish species. He found that those isolated acetylcholine receptors have been crucial to clarifying the path in which brain neurons communicate and interact. While being a first-class molecular and cellular biologist, Changeux is considered a maître pensée, or master for thinking, and a humanist of the 21st century. He is rich in personality and has a unique ability to oscillate between the life sciences and the humanities. Changeux earned a bachelor degree from the École Normale Supérieure in 1955 and a master's degree, and received his agrégation in natural science in 1958. He pursued PhD studies at the Pasteur Institute under the supervision of Jacques Monod and François Jacob. Later, he gained his doctorate in 1964 and left France for postdoctoral studies at the University of California, Berkeley from 1965 to 1966, and 1 year later at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York. Jean-Pierre Changeux was born in Dumont, France in 1936. After his education, he returned to France as attaché to the chair of molecular biology held by one of his former guiding mentors, Jacques Monod. In 1972, he became the director of the Unit of Molecular Neurobiology at the Pasteur Institute, where he received his professor license in 1975. In 1975, Changeux was nominated for the professor at the Collège de France, chair of cell communications, and held this position until 2006. Changeux is an author of more than 600 scientific articles and books. His well-known books are Conversations on Mind, Matter, and Mathematics, L'Homme Neuronal, The Physiology of Truth, Neuroscience and Human Knowledge, What Makes Us Think? A neuroscientist and a philosopher argue about ethics, human nature, and the brain, and Jedonkin Matri. Jean-Pierre Changeux's expertise on isolated acetylcholine receptors applied the structure of allosteric protein and acetylcholine receptor in synaptic transmission at the neuromuscular intersection. Dr. Changeux found the first identification of a channel linked to neurotransmitter receptor protein. The acetylcholine nicotinic receptor was the first membrane receptor molecule that was isolated and characterized. Jean-Pierre Changeux and his group later unraveled the fundamental characteristics of the receptor protein. They discovered the elementary physiochemical properties, the pentameric organization, and the first partial N-terminal amino acid sequence of the one subunit that led to the cloning and complete sequencing of the acetylcholine receptor. They also identified the acetylcholine binding site. Jean-Pierre Changeux further extended these results to neuronal nicotinic receptors in the brain. Among Changeux's many awards, his most well-known one was the 2001 Balzan Prize for Cognitive Neurosciences. Professor Changeux greatly helped our understanding of the fundamental molecular mechanisms of chemical communication in the nervous system. Moreover, Professor Changeux has made a theoretical contribution to the epigenesis of neuronal networks via selective stabilization of developing synapses and on several aspects of cognition. From the mid-1990s, Changeux focused on mathematical modeling to examine the neural basis of cognitive functions. This research was mainly conducted in collaboration with Stanislas Dehaene, like him, a French author and cognitive neuroscientist. The two neuroscientists prominently discovered the relations between the patterns of song in birds and the development of different birds' abilities. Lately, Dehaene and Changeux developed a neuronal model for access to consciousness based on the recruitment of networks of neurons with axons. Changeux was also famously known for his book on the unique idea of the connection between mind and the physical brain. In his work, Conversations on Mind, Matter, and Mathematics, Changeux strongly supports the view that the nervous system functions in a projective rather than reactive style. He believes that our brain has a direct connection with our ancestral environments, following Darwinian natural selection. In this context, focusing more on what is inherent versus what arises from nurturing. He raises several questions. As Plato supposed, and many others have believed since, do we discover knowledge systems, or do we construct them? Does mathematics establish a general language that would allow human beings to communicate with other civilizations in the universe, or is it just a natural language that owes its unexpected existence to the unique evolution of neuronal networks in our brains? Does the physical world accept and follow mathematical laws, or does it seem to agree to the laws simply because physicists have increasingly been able to make reasonable judgment of it? The uncertain status of mathematical objects led Changeux and Canes to the organization and function of the brain, how its embryonic and postnatal development influences the unfolding of mathematical reasoning, cognitive processes, and human intelligence. The two great thinkers delved into ethical questions, querying within the natural foundations of morality and the chance that it may have a neural basis underlying varying social implications. Two questions highlighted the whole book: why logic and rule should exist in the world, and why it should be comprehensible to human beings. Dr. Changeux is pursuing his mission with great conviction. He revisited all the traditional standards of the empiricist, materialist, and nominalist critiques of the Platonist idealism in mathematics. He summoned an impressive mass of scientific data, neurobiology, and cognitive psychology. Overall, his great work has been highly praised and has had a worldwide influence on various scientific fields. For further reading, Neuronal Man, The Physiology of Truth. Conversations on Mind, Matter, and Mathematics. Conscious Space and Nicotinic Receptors. Ruminations on Consciousness by Jean-Pierre Changeux. In Neuronal Man, I tackled the issue of consciousness and the neuronal base of becoming conscious, and stated that the relevant explanation had to be found at the level of a system of neuronal regulations functioning as a global entity. In my 1992 course at the Collège de France, I suggested that the formal neuronal network that Stanislas Dehaene and myself had proposed for the Wisconsin card sorting task could serve as a starting point for the development of a more general model that would include a conscious workspace. Two events prompted us to tackle this modeling in a direct way. On the one hand, Stanislas Dehaene had created a very active independent research group dedicated to brain imaging and started to apply this technique to investigate conscious versus non-conscious tasks. On the other hand, Antonio Catifio gave us the opportunity to present our ideas in Portugal to a group of experts brought together by the Gulbenkian Foundation in the monastery of Arabidia in the summer of 1998. Our position differed from Francis Crick's 40 Hertz reductionism, from Gerald Edelman's complexity dialectic, and from Rodolfo Linus's thalamocortical oscillations. Rather, our intention was to imagine a neuronal architecture that would explain altogether the global and unitary character of the conscious workspace, as suggested by the psychologist Bars, and the diversity of the underlying processes. It was elaborated as a computer model. Dehaene, Kurzberg, and myself proposed that neurons with long axons connecting distinct cortical areas, even different hemispheres, play an essential role in the genesis of the conscious space. In effortful tasks, such as the Stroop test, global representations would differentially mobilize these neurons together with components from specialized processes through mechanisms of evaluation from the outside world, but also through mechanisms of self-evaluation toward the subjective inner world. The proposed computer model is able to successfully simulate the Stroop task. The model also accounts for the top-down control of these global representations upon the activity states of the underlying processes by a simple neuronal mechanism. A tentative answer was brought, in neuronal terms, to the paradox raised by Sperry of the mysterious top-down control of consciousness over lower neuronal processes. Von Economo's studies on the microarchitecture of the cerebral cortex underlined the abundance of pyramidal neurons with long axons in layers 2 and 3 of the cerebral cortex. Interestingly, these layers are especially dense in the so-called association areas, which include the prefrontal cortex. Moreover, brain imaging studies, particularly those formed by Stanislas Dehaene and his group, revealed a strong activation of the prefrontal areas during the accomplishment of conscious tasks requiring an effort. Finally, everyone knows about nicotine's effects on wakefulness and on attention. Was it reasonable to link these theoretical thoughts and the experimental studies carried out with the neuronal receptor? A first link was established by a discovery made by the Australian neurologist Berkovic and the German molecular biologist Steinlein. Berkovic had recognized that several members of the same Australian family suffered from a rare form of autosomal dominant nocturnal frontal lobe epilepsy, which causes loss of consciousness and convulsions. This was the first genetic epilepsy to be identified at the amino acid level. Moreover, it resulted from a mutation of the gene coding for the 4 subunit of the acetylcholine nicotinic receptor. My surprise and delight was even greater when I read in the paper that the particular amino acid whose mutation resulted in seizures was homologous to serine 261 in the M2 segment that we had initially labeled with chlorpromazine in the torpedo receptor. Spontaneous mutations revealed, independently of any preconceived idea, the same amino acid as the one we had labeled in a deliberate way to identify the ion channel. Can a more objective validation of these results be conceived? The subject of the neural basis of consciousness and of its chemistry is henceforth opened to scientific research. The nicotinic receptor may again play a role. Is it a new start for the chemistry of consciousness and cognitive functions? It will require, in order to progress, a multidisciplinary approach that unites life sciences and human sciences at multiple levels of organization, together with human sciences. It is our duty and that of the younger generations to make it work. We are far from the end. Excerpt from the History of Neuroscience in Autobiography, Volume 4, edited by Larry R. Squire. John C. Lilly, by Joseph Perez. American neuroscientist John Cunningham Lilly is most often remembered for his research with dolphins and for his development of sensory deprivation tanks. Born on January 6, 1915, he was a counterculture scientist who frequently incorporated the usage of LSD and other psychedelic drugs in his experimentations and theories. Because of his, at times, questionable experimentations, Lilly constantly faced public criticism as well as scientific skepticism with regards to his work. After receiving his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania, through which he gained an interest in the field of biophysics, John C. Lilly joined the National Institute of Mental Health and began experimenting on the brain in pursuit of the conscious self. Soon after, he began development on the sensory deprivation chamber in response to a puzzle posed by scientists about human consciousness. The puzzle concerned whether the human awareness required external stimulation through the physical body in order to be maintained. The answer provided by the sensory deprivation chamber? No. Consciousness did not depend on physical stimuli. Essentially, Lilly managed to replicate sensory isolation by filling a tank full of warm salt water in a dark and soundproof room. Once he had mastered this procedure, he would begin experimenting and theorizing on the topic of consciousness in other species. While he experimented, usually on himself, with LSD and the sensory deprivation chamber, sometimes combining both, Lilly would go on to formulate his theories about the almost unlimited range of human cognition. Initially, much of his experimentation was on dolphins, for which he received a large grant from NASA, and he became famous for emphasizing the mammal's extraordinary intelligence. His work also formed the intellectual basis of two famous Hollywood movies, The Day of the Dolphins and Altered States. Lilly formulated his own views on consciousness through a growing understanding of Buddhist meditative practices and his revelations about his own LSD and ketamine use. In his book, published in 1968, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, Theory and Experiments, and The Center of the Cyclone, Lilly describes what he calls the human biocomputer, which compares human biology to the hardware and software of a computer. He divides the perceivable reality into 11 different levels. Level 1 contains external forces such as heat and sound. Level 2 contains the body's system and functions. Level 3 contains the brain and its biochemistry. Level 4 is the neural activity. Level 5 through 10 are essentially the memory storage and the programs of the human biocomputer. Levels past 10 are left purposefully unknown by Lilly, so that future developments into the theory can be inserted with future research. He often left many of his theories open for future input and the possibilities to be expanded upon, as he often thought about the implications and future uses of his findings and developments. In many ways, he believed that the physical body was hindering the otherwise limitless brain's ability to transcend and perceive beyond the body's limitations. To solve this, he believed sensory deprivation tanks, as well as drug use, would allow the user to think beyond their biological limitations. In his 1978 book, The Scientist, Lilly predicted that there will come a time where humans will develop a new kind of intelligence through technology. However, he describes it as a mixture of both biology and technology, which he believed would lead to catastrophic consequences and conflicts in the future, as a debate between consciousness and ethicality would ensue. It is important to note that some of his most controversial ideas have stemmed from drug-induced visions. Lilly believed that there exists a group called the Cosmic Coincidence Control Center, within which there exists a subgroup called the Galactic Coincidence Control, within which there also exists a subgroup which is called the Earth Coincidence Control Center. His attempt to explain and experience coincidence requires the user to be aware and follow 9 different rules, the last of which is a motto that reads, "Cosmic love is absolutely ruthless and highly indifferent. It teaches its lessons whether you dislike them or not." Additionally, Lilly was also part of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence project, where techniques to detect evidence of intelligence outside of the solar system were discussed. During this project, the Drake equation was heavily discussed. After the dissolution of the experiment for which he is most known, on dolphin language and communication, Lilly futilely attempted to communicate with dolphins using methods such as telepathy. The nature of his work garnered controversy in the scientific community due to his drug use, as well as the radical work he conducted with dolphins. For example, when he revealed that he had been giving doses of LSD to his dolphin test subjects at the Communication Research Institute, which he founded, on the island of St. Thomas, he suggested that the dolphins became more communicative. The experiment has been panned and described as an ethical failure. Part of the controversy revolved around the treatment of a dolphin by a female researcher who did not discourage the sexual feelings the dolphin developed for her. Researchers of dolphin communication severely disagree with Lilly's procedures and findings, although the original hypothesis that dolphins may have the cognitive ability for human-like language skills has now found more substantive evidence to support it. Despite the condemnation around this treatment of his subjects, Lilly's experiments brought public awareness to the intelligence of dolphins, which are consequently now regarded as one of the most intelligent animals on Earth. In contemporary society, research into the intelligence of dolphins continues largely as a result of the work of John C. Lilly. Lilly died on September 20, 2001, of heart failure. For further reading, The Center of the Cyclone, The Scientist, Simulations of God, Christoph Koch, by E. Cheng Lam. One of the most distinguished pioneers in the study of consciousness in the 20th century is German-American neuroscientist Christoph Koch. He was born on November 13, 1956, in the Midwestern United States, and was raised in Canada and Morocco. Koch is best known for his work on the neural basis of consciousness. In 1982, he received a PhD from the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, Germany. He became a professor at the California Institute of Technology from 1986 until 2013. In 2011, Christoph Koch joined the Allen Institute for Brain Science as Chief Scientific Officer and became president in 2015. Christoph Koch focuses on perception, memory, behavior, and consciousness, and he found out how neurons can multiply the relationship between intra- and extracellular potential, and how this gives rise to the local field potential and the large-scale current sinks and sources. He pointed out that the attentional saliency map hypothesis for biological and computer vision, according to which one or more topographic organized spatial maps summarize bottom-up salient information in the visual system. Christoph Koch has published more than 300 scientific papers and 5 books. The first book that Christoph Koch published is Methods in Neural Modeling, which focuses on how information is processed in the nervous systems from the level of individual ionic channels to large-scale neuronal networks. His text, The Quest for Consciousness, a Neurobiological Approach, is extremely accessible and summarizes the main known biological facts that seem particularly pertinent to the mind-brain problem, particularly visual awareness. Christoph Koch integrates evidence from electrophysiological data, imaging and psychophysical studies, computational models, and clinical observations into a comprehensive and integral whole. The book appeals to neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and philosophers concerned with the scientific study of consciousness. Even though most of the book is written with a pragmatic emphasis on the neurobiology of consciousness, the first chapter still provides a concise summary of some of the most prevalent philosophical approaches to consciousness. Koch's moving autobiography is Consciousness: Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. In this book, Christoph Koch focuses on questions like what links the conscious experience of pain, joy, color, and smell to bioelectrical activity in the brain. How can anything physical give rise to non-physical, subjective, conscious states? In his career, he has centered his work on the seemingly unbridgeable gap between the physics of the brain and phenomenal experience. This book is a part scientific overview, part memoir, part futurist speculation for an empirical explanation of consciousness. Christoph Koch recounts not only the birth of the modern science of consciousness, but also the underlying motivation for his quest for the belief that life is meaningful. Koch describes his groundbreaking works with Francis Crick in the 1990s and 2000s on visual perception and its relation to self-reflective awareness. Christoph Koch provides a rich panoply of stories drawn from modern research into the neurobiology of consciousness, as well as his reflections on a variety of topics, such as the distinction between attention and awareness, the unconscious, how neurons respond to Homer Simpson, the physics and biology of free will, dogs, Der Ring des Nibelungen, sentient machines, the loss of his belief in a personal God, and sadness. Throughout it all, Koch wants to uncover the roots of awareness and what it means to be a human being. Koch's latest work is The Feeling of Life Itself. Here, he argues that what is needed to answer certain key questions in philosophy and psychology is a quantitative theory that starts with experience and proceeds to an up-to-date and accurate model of the brain. In The Feeling of Life Itself, Christoph Koch outlines such a theory that is based on Integrated Information Theory, or IIT. The theory predicts that many, and perhaps all animals, experience consciousness, and that it is much more widespread than we ever thought possible. Contrary to received wisdom, however, Christoph Koch argues that programmable computers will not have consciousness. Even a perfect software model of the brain is not conscious. Its simulation is fake consciousness. Consciousness is not a special type of computation, and it is not a clever hack. When asked the question by Antonio Regaldo, if I build a perfect software model of the brain, it would never be conscious, but a specially designed machine that mimics the brain could be? Koch gave the following reply. Correct. This theory clearly says that a digital simulation would not be conscious, which is strikingly different from the dominant functionalist belief of 99% of the people at MIT or philosophers like Daniel Dennett. They all say, once you simulate everything, nothing else is required, and it's going to be conscious. I think consciousness, like mass, is a fundamental property of the universe. The analogy, and it's a very good one, is that you can make a pretty good weather prediction these days. You can predict the inside of a storm, but it's never wet inside the computer. You can simulate a black hole in a computer, but space-time will not be bent. Simulating something is not the real thing. It's the same thing with consciousness. In 100 years, you might be able to simulate consciousness on a computer, but it won't experience anything. Nada. It will be black inside. It will have no experience whatsoever, even though it may have our intelligence and our ability to speak. I am not saying consciousness is a magic soul. It is something physical. Consciousness is always supervening onto the physical, but it takes a particular type of hardware to instantiate it. A computer made up of transistors moving charge on and off a gate, with each gate being connected to a smaller number of gates, is just a very different cause and effect structure than what we have in the brain, where you have one neuron connected to 10,000 input neurons and projecting to 10,000 other neurons. But if you were to build the computer in an appropriate way, like a neuromorphic computer, it could be conscious. Although Koch is a highly respected scientist, he tries to present his ideas to the public in a clear and cognate fashion. He is clearly one of those thinkers that others in the field of consciousness studies keep a close tab on, given his brilliant intellect and his willingness to explore unpopular ideas. For further reading, The Feeling of Life Itself. The Quest for Consciousness. Consciousness. Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. Christoph Koch on 5 Myths About Consciousness. Excerpted from The Washington Post, July 26, 2019. Consciousness refers to any subjective experience, the delectable taste of Nutella, the sharp sting of an infected tooth, the slow passage of time when bored, the sense of vitality and anxiety just before a competitive event. In the words of the philosopher Thomas Nagel, consciousness exists in a human or other subject whenever there is something it is like to be that organism. The concept has inspired countless philosophical theories since antiquity and much laboratory work over the past century, but it has also given rise to many misunderstandings. Myth number 1. Humans have a unique brain. There's a long history of scientists thinking they have identified a particular feature to explain our advanced consciousness and planetary dominance. In a popular TED Talk, the neuroscientist Susanna Herculano-Huzel argues that the human brain's distinctiveness lies in the huge number of neurons that make up the outermost layer of the organ, the cerebral cortex, or neocortex. 16 billion out of some 86 billion total neurons. That's the simplest explanation of our remarkable cognitive abilities, she says. Other suppositions have included special brain regions or nerve cells found only or primarily in humans. Spindle or von Economo neurons, for example. Or perhaps the human brain consumes more calories than the brains of other species. After close to 2 centuries of brain research, however, no single feature of the human brain truly stands out. We certainly do not possess the largest brain. Elephants and whales trounce us. Recent research has revealed that pilot whales, a type of dolphin, have 37 billion cortical neurons, undermining Herculano-Huzel's hypothesis. And researchers have found that whales, elephants, and other large-brained animals, not just great apes and humans, also have von Economo neurons. New research shows that humans and mice have about the same number of categories of brain cells. The fact is, there is no simple brain-centric explanation for why humans sit atop the cognitive hill. Myth number 2. Science will never understand consciousness. This is a particularly pernicious myth because it inhibits research. I have a much easier time imagining how we understand the Big Bang than I have imagining how we can understand consciousness, the eminent string theorist Ed Witten has said. It's likely to remain a mystery, he insists. The hard problem of consciousness, some say insurmountable, is the phrase the philosopher David Chalmers coined to describe the immense leap required to move from understanding which brain events are linked to consciousness to how they would give rise to consciousness. But the argument that difficult science problems are unsolvable has a very poor track record. And scientists and clinicians have learned more about consciousness over the past century plus than in all of preceding history. An entire profession, anesthesiology, is devoted to safely turning consciousness off and on again. We are getting better at detecting its presence or absence in neurologically impaired patients unable to speak or otherwise interact with their environment by stimulating their brains using a magnetic pulse and then monitoring the echoes of the evoked electrical activity crisscrossing the neocortex. Researchers study the neuronal footprint of consciousness by presenting images or other stimuli to people in magnetic scanners and identifying which brain regions respond. These advances have not solved the hard problem, to be sure, but there is little reason for pessimism that they won't eventually. Myth number 3. Dreams contain hidden clues about our secret desires. Sigmund Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. Much 20th century thinking about dreams has been influenced by his theory that at the heart of any dream is the fulfillment of desires and wishes that are suppressed by the mind. In psychoanalytic theory, dreams represent wish fulfillment, unconscious desires, and conflicts, as the website Good Therapy puts it, and are often rife with repressed symbolic meaning. They have to be deciphered using free association or other methods. But modern research exploring the content of dreams of healthy subjects, as well as dreams of patients suffering from trauma, does not support this theory. William Domhoff, a research psychologist, maintains an online dream bank with more than 20,000 curated dream reports. It and other resources make clear that most of our dreams contain residue from our daily concerns and events, interrupted by seemingly random episodes, either imagined or recalled, and woven into the narrative tapestry. There is usually clear continuity between dream content and waking conceptions. People who are anxious have anxiety dreams. Victims of trauma have flashbacks or reoccurrences of their traumatic experiences. Sometimes we express sexual longing for somebody, but that hardly requires decoding. By and large, dreams do not disguise our desires, but rather express our concerns in a readily understandable and coherent manner. Myth number 4. We are susceptible to subliminal messages. Subliminal advertising, which includes words or images that can't be consciously perceived, became famous in 1957 after a marketing researcher claimed to have radically boosted sales of popcorn and Coca-Cola in a movie theater by flashing the phrases "eat popcorn and drink Coca-Cola" on screen for a single frame. He later admitted he'd made up the data, but interest in the concept persisted. In the book Subliminal Seduction, author Wilson Key claimed that 99% of alcohol ads include subliminal messages. In 2000, Republicans were accused of trying to unconsciously manipulate voters with a TV ad that attacked the role of bureaucrats in an Al Gore healthcare plan and lingered ever so briefly on the letters RATS. To be sure, over the years, some studies have found evidence that unconsciously presented words and images can influence ideas and behavior, but many of those studies could not be replicated. One influential 1970 study found that exposure to the word Coke increased thirst, but it fell apart when conducted again in 1989. Although research continues, the best evidence suggests that if subliminal messages have any effects at all, they are inconsistent, small, and short-lived. One 2015 study found that unconscious exposure to a brand name raised interest in that brand a bit, but also that the effect evaporated after 15 minutes. You need not worry about subliminal propaganda. As the present political moment makes clear, it is overt, conscious messages, hateful insults directed by influential people at members of minority groups, for example, that hold the real power. Myth number 5. Near-death visions are clear evidence of life after death. Patients revived after heart failure or other close-to-fatal episodes sometimes report having felt detached from their body, seeing a bright light, or sensing that they are in the presence of the numinous. Many consider these experiences to be proof of a divine realm. Ibn Alexander, in the bestseller Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, reported while deep in a coma, entering the strangest, most beautiful world I'd ever seen. Pondering the implications, he wrote, "So I was communicating directly with God? Absolutely." Once dismissed by scientists as idiosyncratic hallucinations or derided as occult experiences, these episodes are now drawing close attention. Epidemiological surveys find that significant near-death visions are not that rare, occurring in roughly a tenth of patients who have undergone cardiac arrest. It appears that they are related to neurological events that occur when particular cortical regions are starved of oxygen critical to their function, though the precise cause is unknown. Similar intensely felt experiences occur during temporal lobe epileptic seizures or during direct stimulation of certain regions of the exposed cortex during neurosurgery. further evidence of their biological, not spiritual, origins. Visions that people experience when near death, often devoid of religious content, appear to be attempts by the brain to continue to do its job of comprehending the world even when its own function is hampered and when some of its perceptual and memory circuits are offline or generating spurious activity. Though we don't need to turn to supernatural explanations, it is important to study why these events leave many patients with a long-lasting sense of calm, serenity, and acceptance of their eventual demise. Understanding that could lead to therapeutic breakthroughs. Owen Flanagan by Pacey Minaya. Consciousness has long puzzled humanity and influenced human thought for generations. Perhaps one of the most coherent interpreters of consciousness is philosopher Owen Flanagan. Born in Westchester County, New York in 1949, Owen Flanagan is known primarily for his optimistic approach to understanding consciousness with a unified theory of consciousness, which he dubs constructive naturalism. Flanagan received his Ph.D. in 1978 from Boston University. From 1978 to 1993, Flanagan worked as a professor of philosophy for Wellesley College. In 2016, he was recognized as a Berggruen Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University and a Rockefeller Fellow at the National Humanities Center. In 1993, Flanagan took a position teaching philosophy at Duke University, where he currently works as a distinguished professor of philosophy. His other interests include moral psychology, East Asian philosophy, and comparative philosophy. Flanagan defines consciousness as a heterogeneous set of events and processes that share the property of being experienced. Consciousness is taken to name a set of processes, not a thing or a mental faculty. In saying this, Flanagan brings to light the notion that consciousness is the recognition that one is able to recognize experience, which is brought about because of highly developed neural networks. In his book titled Consciousness Reconsidered, Flanagan considers the gaps between the phenomenological, psychological, and neuroscientific explanations for consciousness. To him, consciousness is rendered not by adopting an either-or mentality, but through a marriage between these disciplines. In considering both the scientific and philosophical nature of consciousness, Flanagan argues for a constructive naturalist theory of consciousness, one that intricately synthesizes these academic fields. In doing so, Flanagan creates a science of the mind. Three key elements of this budding science are being attentive to subjective reports on consciousness, analyzing theories and results from psychology and cognitive science, and digesting conclusions from neuroscience that explore how systems in the brain produce consciousness. By emphasizing each element, Flanagan believes that it is possible to make consciousness, a completely convoluted and enigmatic concept, intelligible. According to Flanagan, there are several main philosophical positions on the problem of consciousness that open the discussion: non-naturalism, principled agnosticism, anti-constructive naturalism, eliminativist naturalism, and finally, the constructive naturalist theory he means to defend. The first view, non-naturalism, stresses that consciousness is not a natural phenomenon and therefore cannot be understood in naturalistic terms. Flanagan believes that this view, while seemingly factual, is incorrect because it places too much weight on speculation and seemingly miraculous nature. Second, there is principled agnosticism. Principled agnosticism is somewhat of a reaction to naturalism in that it posits that naturalism is a position people do not yet understand, and because they do not fully understand how the conscious brain is animated, it is baseless to claim belief in this theory. Principled agnosticism implies that people simply do not and cannot understand what it would mean to give an objective account of subjectivity. Third, there is anti-constructive naturalism, or the new Mysterianism. This is another view that believes naturalism is true. It states that there are in fact properties of the brain that account naturally for consciousness, but it is not possible for people to fully grasp these properties and/or explain how consciousness depends on them. This view claims that consciousness will forever be mysterious to human minds. In other words, the anti-constructive naturalistic views believe that the problem of consciousness is not that humans cannot ask questions, but that they lack the mental prowess to find answers. Fourth, there is eliminative naturalism. Again, in this view, naturalism is true. This perspective implies that the brain will tell the complete story of our mental life, but there is still a sense in which consciousness cannot be explained. Consciousness is a concept that is simultaneously too simplistic, too vague, and too historically imbued in false and confused theory to effectively denote a phenomenon or set of phenomena in need of explanation. According to Flanagan, there is a need to eliminate paramount concepts like qualia and subjectivity from explanations of the mind and to instead seek more credible substitutes rendered by neuroscientific theory. Finally, there is constructive naturalism, which is the position Flanagan aims to defend. This theory claims that consciousness is a natural byproduct of humankind's evolutionary processes. The constructive naturalistic theory is committed to the view that the capacity to experience things evolved via the processes responsible for the development of our nervous system: migration, mutation, genetic drift, natural selection, and free riding. This theory refutes that consciousness is miraculous, as if it had come from a transcendental being, and instead adheres to a neo-Darwinian theory that posits human consciousness as a byproduct of evolutionary processes. In line with the anti-constructivist, new Mysterianist, and the eliminativist theories, this view claims that naturalism is true. However, against the anti-constructivist and principled agnostic, Flanagan believes that there is sound reason to be optimistic about humans' abilities to understand the relationships between consciousness and the brain. Moreover, Flanagan also notes that the phenomenal qualitative consciousness is what needs to be explained through ordinary first-person modes for classifying subjectivity. According to Flanagan, there is a substantial probability that there is a large set of neural connections capable of subserving different kinds of conscious experience. And if this is true, then there exist generalizations linking the neural with the phenomenological. He claims that if there are different sets of brain properties that are delegated to different types of conscious experiences, then there may very well be certain types of phenomenal experiences that do not map in clear-cut neurological pathways. An experiment involving monkeys helps justify this position. Flanagan reports on an experiment conducted to test the awareness and subjectivity of monkeys. In this experiment, scientists trained several monkeys to report whether they perceived a line moving up or moving down, which was achieved by training the monkeys to give bar press reports or by training them to execute a saccade, a quick eye movement, to the left if a downward movement is perceived, and to the right if an upward movement is perceived. Ultimately, this experiment showcases that a monkey's account of how images appear at any moment, its phenomenology, provides clear psychophysical data about the rate of monkey perception and the shifts in said perception. Upon analyzing this experiment, Flanagan concludes that the phenomenological data and the psychophysical data about the time between perceptual switches yield no information about what is going on in the brain, and in particular, they yield no information about what neuronal events are involved in the shifting perceptions. This is where looking at the brain helps, and why it is important to employ a holistic view of the brain. He later writes, "It is well known that monkeys have as many as 20 to 25 visual areas in the neocortex. The bulk of retinal output projects through the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus to the primary visual cortex at the back of the brain that computes edges. Motion detection occurs primarily in the middle temporal and medial superior temporal areas in the superior temporal sulcus, STS. So, the activity of neurons in the STS were monitored as the monkeys reported upward or downward motion. The study of the effect of the rival stimuli on 66 single neurons indicated that the activity of many neurons was dictated by the retinal stimulation. Other neurons, however, reflected the monkeys' reported perception of motion direction. The principle of supervenience says that every difference at the level of mentality must be subserved by a difference at some lower level, but perhaps not conversely. This experiment indicates how the robust phenomenological difference between an upward or downward moving image might be subserved, although undoubtedly not exclusively, by small but detectable changes in activity in the cortical areas subserving motion detection. Flanagan describes this theory as neurophilosophical, in that it tries to synthesize a naturalistic metaphysic of mind with the wonky yet maturing understanding of how the brain works. To Flanagan, the most plausible hypothesis is that the mind is the brain, which is indicative of the naturalistic position he believes in. Thinking that consciousness is terminally mysterious is easy to fall for if we set impossibly high standards on explanation and intelligibility. With a constructive naturalistic viewpoint, consciousness simply cannot be considered at the surface. Though he believes that consciousness will still remain an elaborate, enigmatic concept, Flanagan believes that through constructive naturalism, we will be at least a step closer to navigating the maze of the mind. Flanagan proposes that scholars utilize the natural method to see if there is the possibility of making consciousness intelligible. This method proposes 3 different modes of analysis and provides steps for doing so. First, scholars must give phenomenology its credit. Then, scholars must listen carefully to what individuals have to say about how things seem and how they view consciousness. At this stage, it is necessary to let the psychologists and cognitive scientists contribute their views as well. Finally, scholars must consult neuroscientists and hear what they have to say, specifically about how conscious mental events are realized and how they can examine the overlap between their stories and the phenomenological and psychological stories. This view was proven in experiments cross-examining the behaviors of human beings and monkeys. This experiment found that both humans and monkeys react to stimuli that they are made aware of. This experiment demonstrates how subjective awareness can be studied by meshing information from different levels of analysis and techniques. First, there is the assumption that there is something it is like for a monkey to have visual experience. Second, good old-fashioned psychological techniques of operant conditioning are used to train the monkeys to provide reports about what they see. Finally, these reports are linked with detailed observations of the activity of 66 distinct neurons to yield information about the distinct brain processes subserving perceptual experiences of upward and downward moving lines. This is knowledge by triangulation. The natural method works. In employing the natural method, Flanagan hopes to see whether and to what extent the 3 different accounts of consciousness, phenomenological, psychological, and neuroscientific, are congruent with one another. For further reading, The Problem of the Soul, The Geography of Morals, The Really Hard Problem. Terence McKenna by Yan Shu. Terence Kemp McKenna is an American philosopher, psychonaut, and ethnobotanist. His life was full of extraordinary adventures and ideas that many people considered radical and insane. He was one of the most famous pioneers in the field of human consciousness in the 20th century and was well known for his explorations of psychedelics. In the year of 1946, he was born in Paonia, Colorado. He is half Irish from his father's family and half Welsh from his mother's ancestry. In his early childhood, he was interested in fossil hunting and human history under his uncle's influence, which later on established his devotion to the complexity of language and history. He came upon an essay entitled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which opened a door for him towards the study of human consciousness. McKenna also read Carl Jung writings at the age of 10, which fueled his interest in the field of psychology. In addition, according to the interview between Bodhi Tree Book Reviewers co-editor Mark Canaston and McKenna in 1993, McKenna admitted that Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell made him aware of psychedelic substances when he was a young teenager. As he stated in the interview, "I regard science fiction as the entry drug into the psychedelic world. This interest motivated him to travel to Jerusalem and Nepal while he was enrolled in the University of California, Berkeley. In Jerusalem and Nepal, he continued his journey of curiosity by studying shamanism and psychoactive drugs such as hashish. McKenna was fascinated by the internal experiences that lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, produced to him. Due to this reason, McKenna traveled with his brother Dennis to the Colombian Amazon in order to search for the ukuhi, which is a plant that contains dimethyltryptamine. However, they did not find the plant. Instead, they found the gigantic psilocybe cubensis mushrooms. In 1971, he returned back to the University of California and finished his study of shamanism and ecology. He also brought back the spores from Amazon, which allowed him to cultivate psilocybin mushrooms. He then published a book called Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. According to McKenna, he believes that the mushrooms were found by the early proto-human primates who try to search for the new resources of food. In his book, Foods of the Gods, he claims since the mushrooms improve visual acuity and stimulate sexual desire, it actually increases reproduction success and is evolutionary beneficial. Besides that, McKenna also points out that psilocybin is the catalyst for the human language and art. All of the mental functions that we associate with humanness, including recall, projective imagination, language, naming, magical speech, dance, and a sense of religion, may have emerged out of interaction with hallucinogenic plants. McKenna advocates the usage of natural psychedelic substances because he suggests that it takes people to a higher level of understanding the universal mysteries by elevating them to another dimension through hallucination. McKenna describes the experiences of hallucination as a revelation of an alien dimension, a brightly lit, non-three-dimensional, self-contorting, linguistically intending modality that couldn't be denied. Basically, he justifies the usage of psychedelic substances by stating that it opens the path of imaginations for the human to discover the truth of reality. In his book, The Archaic Revival, he wrote, "Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally laid down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong." Upon that, he also hypothesizes that psilocybin mushrooms might be a higher form of intelligence that makes humans to reconsider the relationship between nature and man. Due to the early study of shamanism, McKenna was heavily influenced by the fractal patterns in Chinese philosophy of the I Ching, which later contributed to his theory of time wave, novelty theory. According to John Major Jenkins' article, Early 2012 Books, McKenna and Waters, Terence advanced the notion that time is not a constant, but has different qualities tending toward either habit or novelty. In the early 1970s, Terence developed a graph of time wave data based on I Ching's 64 hexagrams. He analyzed the degree of difference between each hexagram and found out the mathematical orders and intentional construct within I Ching. This study leads him to notice how time obtains certain behavior called self-same similarity, which means that its small section is identical to the future's larger event. Jenkins' article also concludes Terence's novelty theory implies that larger intervals, occurring long ago, contained the same amount of information as shorter, more recent intervals. History was being compressed, moving quicker, and the process had to have an end. This theory helps him identify the date of the ultimate end of the process. He decided to choose 1945's atomic explosion as an extremely novel date for human history and predicted that the final phase would happen in 2012, which corresponds with Mayan calendar's prediction of cataclysmic events. Although McKenna was known as a pioneer in the field of psychedelics, McKenna faced a lot of criticism for justifying the usage of such drugs. Others, however, lauded his efforts. The article Terence McKenna, 53, Dies, Patron of Psychedelic Drugs by Douglas Martin wrote that Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead said that he was the only person who has made a serious effort to objectify the psychedelic experience. McKenna was one of the few pioneers who saw the future of virtual reality and the internet in the 1990s. According to the article, Terence McKenna's Last Trip by Davis Eric, Terence observed that psychedelic cultures would become common on the internet. He argued, psychedelics were always about information. Their very existence was forbidden knowledge at one point. You had to be Aldous Huxley to even know about them. Unfortunately, McKenna died at the young age of 53 in the year 2000 due to brain cancer. However, his work has become even more widely known today, and his influence has grown exponentially over the past 2 decades. For further reading, The Problem of the Soul, The Geography of Morals, The Really Hard Problem. Excerpt from Terence McKenna's Last Trip, Wired Magazine, January 5, 2000. The psychedelic experience is not the equivalent of a dust bunny under your psychic bed, says McKenna. It's a product of the fractal laws that govern the world at an informational level. There is no deeper truth. McKenna is the most loved psychedelic barnstormer since Timothy Leary, the self-appointed guru of LSD who died in 1996 amid a flurry of digital hype about online euthanasia and his plans, which he scrapped, to undergo chironic preservation. Like McKenna, Leary was an intellectual entertainer, a carny barker hawking tickets to the Molecular Mind show. McKenna calls it the Harlequin role. At the same time, McKenna is a far mellower man than Leary. I don't seek to live forever, he says, and I don't want the removal of my head to become a net event. Leary spent the late 60s attempting to gather a hippie army under the notorious battle cry of turn on, tune in, drop out. Taking his advice, McKenna headed to East India, where he bought Mahayana art and smuggled hashish, until a stateside bust forced him into hiding in the wilds of Indonesia. In 1971, he and his brother went to the Amazon to hunt for ayahuasca, a legendary shamanic brew. But when they arrived at the Colombian village of La Carrera that spring, what they found were fields blanketed with Stropharia cubensis, aka magic mushrooms. Within 36 hours of his seizure, 1,400 messages poured into McKenna's email inbox. The flood is testament to his underground stature. In some ways, it was a turning point in American psychedelic culture. Back home, Leary's LSD shock troops had already disintegrated into harder drugs and bad vibes, and Leary himself was hiding out abroad after escaping from a U.S. jail. Serious heads knew all about the psilocybin mushrooms from scholarly books on shamanism, but no one in the U.S. was eating S. cubensis in the early 70s because no one had figured out how to cultivate them. After returning from South America, the McKennas discovered the secret, which they promptly published. Magic mushrooms were on the menu. McKenna farmed shrooms into the 1980s. He could turn out 70 pounds of them every 6 weeks, like clockwork. The trade financed the middle-class existence of a relatively settled man. Then, a good friend of his, an acid chemist, got busted. They fucked him so terrifyingly that I saw I couldn't do this anymore. I had to work something else out. What McKenna worked out was Terence McKenna, a charismatic talking head he marketed, slowly but successfully, to the cultural early adopters. McKenna got his 15 minutes of fame when 4 of his books came out in rapid succession. His 1991 collection of essays, The Archaic Rival, is particularly influential, especially among ravers and other alternative tribes attracted to the idea that new technologies and ancient pagan rites point toward the same ecstatic truths. Food of the Gods, published in 1992, aims directly at highbrows. In it, McKenna lays out a solid, if unorthodox case that psychedelics helped kickstart human consciousness and culture, giving our mushroom-munching ancestors a leg up on rivals by enhancing their visual and linguistic capacities. Though anthropologists ignored his arguments, the time was right for McKenna's visions. He was tempted with movie deals, got featured in magazines, and toured like a madman. He hobnobbed with Silicon Valley hotshots like interface gurus Brenda Laurel and Jerome Lanier, and performed at raves with techno groups like The Shaman. Timothy Leary called him the Timothy Leary of the 1990s. McKenna also was a popularizer of virtual reality and the Internet, arguing as early as 1990 that VR would be a boon to psychedelicists and business people alike. But unlike Leary, who planned to use the net as a stage for his final media prank, McKenna realized that the Internet would be the place where psychedelic culture could flourish on its own. Psychedelics were always about information, McKenna observes. Their very existence was forbidden knowledge at one point. You had to be Aldous Huxley to even know about them. To his great satisfaction, McKenna has lived to see the psychedelic underground self-organize online. Sites like the Lyceum and the Vaults of Erowid now provide loads of information on chemistry, legal status, dosage effects, and, perhaps most important to the uninitiated, experiential feedback. Other groups, like the Hefter Research Institute and the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, use the web to further their advocacy efforts. But to McKenna, the net is more than just an information source. He is convinced that an unprecedented dialogue is going on between individual human beings and the sum total of human knowledge. The Internet is an oracle for anyone in trouble, McKenna explains, using his illness as an example. Within 10 minutes, I can be pouring through reams of control studies, medical data, and personal reports. If anything, my cancer has made me even more enthusiastic about the idea that through information, people can take control of and guide their own lives. Unfortunately, by last October, 5 months after the initial diagnosis and treatment, he needed much more than just information. Despite the radiation therapy, the tumor was still spreading. McKenna traveled to the medical center at UC San Francisco, where a team of specialists surgically removed the bulk of the tumor. They then soaked the cavity with P53, a genetically altered adenovirus meant to scramble the hyperactive self-replication subroutines of the remaining tissue's DNA. Gene therapy is highly experimental, as Silnes put it. McKenna became a full-on guinea pig. At first, the doctors at UCSF were extremely pleased with the results, and for 4 months, the tumor cooled its heels. But in February, an MRI revealed that it had returned with a vengeance, spreading so thoroughly throughout McKenna's brain that it was deemed inoperable. He retreated to a friend's house in Marin County, and his family began to gather. By the time you read this, Terence McKenna will likely have died. David John Chalmers by Diana Hernandez. One of the world's preeminent philosophers of mind and language, best known for breathing new life into the enigma of human consciousness, is Australian cognitive scientist David John Chalmers. Born on April 20, 1966 in the Emerald City, Sydney, he experienced synesthesia, music-produced strong color sensations in his mind, as a young boy. During his youth, he performed exceptionally well in math and attained a bronze medal in the International Mathematical Olympiad. Chalmers received an undergraduate degree in pure mathematics from the University of Adelaide. He continued his education at the University of Oxford, where he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. He later received his PhD in cognitive science and philosophy from Indiana University at Bloomington. Chalmers established his name after presenting a lecture at the inaugural Toward a Science of Consciousness conference in 1994. An article in the Chronicle of Higher Education claims that it established him as a thinker to be reckoned with and goosed an ascent field into greater prominence. His first professorship landed him at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he published the widely regarded book, The Conscious Mind. Chalmers later was appointed professor of philosophy and director of the Center of Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona. He later returned to Australia, where he was named honorary professor of philosophy at the Australian National University. He is also associated with New York University and currently serves as their professor of philosophy and neuroscience. He is co-founder and past president of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness and co-director of the Phil Papers Foundation. In 2013, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Art and Sciences. Today, He works as an editor on topics related to the philosophy of mind for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Chalmers is famous for formulating the hard problem of consciousness, which he first referenced in his landmark paper, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness, and later in his earliest book, The Conscious Mind. The hard problem asks the question, how can the mechanisms of the brain, neurons and synapses, produce self-reflective consciousness? A distinction is made between the easy, cognitive problems of consciousness and the hard, phenomenal problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness include, but are not limited to, explaining the ability to integrate information, focus attention, and report mental states. These issues are considered relatively easy because they can be solved by specifying a mechanism that can perform the task. Despite how poorly understood or complex an easy problem may be, it can ultimately be explained by relying entirely on standard scientific methodologies. Chalmers believes that the problem of experience is apart from this series and will persist even when the performance of all relevant functions is explained. The fundamental difference between the easy problems and the hard problem is that the former is, theoretically, answerable through physicalism, the dominant approach in the philosophy of mind. In his notable 1995 paper, Chalmers stated the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whirl of information processing, but there is also a subjective aspect. During a 2017 interview with ABC's Daniel Kane, Chalmers remarked, "It is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable, and yet it does. Simply put, why should moving parts produce sensation and perception? Why should only brains be responsible for consciousness? Let's take, for example, the universal experience of feeling pain. To argue that it is nothing more than positioning of particles ignores the fact that pain literally hurts. During the 1950s, philosophers at the University of Adelaide, self-proclaimed eliminative materialists, argued that brain states do not merely generate conscious experiences, but literally are them. A notorious critic of Chalmers' work and eliminative materialist Daniel Dennett asserts that consciousness itself is an illusion. However, the reality of experience refutes this idea. We are left with a discontinuity in our scientific worldview, an explanatory gap, a term coined by philosopher Joseph Levine. Chalmers argues in favor of an explanatory gap, from objective to subjective. He denounces physicalists' simplification of the mental experience, similar to those made by his philosophical arch-nemesis Daniel Dennett, making him, in essence, a dualist. Chalmers prefers to distinguish his view as naturalistic dualism. He believes that mental states are caused by physical systems, i.e. the brain, and that mental states differentiate from and cannot be reduced to physical systems. His views align with a traditional expression such as property dualism. Property dualism is a position within the philosophy of mind that affirms that although the world is composed of only one kind of substance, the physical kind, there exist two different kinds of properties, mental properties and physical properties. Simply put, non-physical, mental properties, such as emotions, desires, and beliefs, by nature supervene on or inhere in physical substances, such as the brain. In contrast, substance dualism admits there exist two structurally distinct kinds of properties, making it susceptible to the mind-body problem. Nonetheless, both property and substance dualism can agree in their opposition to reductive physicalism. Reductive physicalism is a doctrine stating that everything in the world can be reduced to its fundamental material or physical basis. Chalmers famously declared his commitment to the logical, albeit unnatural, possibility of philosophical zombies. These aren't the zombies depicted in Hollywood movies, but complete physical replicas of humans deprived of qualitative experience. Chalmers' argument is reminiscent of René Descartes' philosophical proposition, "I think, therefore I am," where he claims that because said zombies are imaginable to us, they must be logically possible. If they are logically possible, then science and qualia, subjective first-person experience, are not entirely defined by physical properties alone. The facts surrounding them are further facts that do not follow logically from the physical facts of the world. Chalmers offers the argument that consciousness is a foundational property that operates autonomously of any known or possible physical properties. He believes that what he labels psychophysical laws govern which physical systems affiliate with which types of qualia. Furthermore, he theorizes that all information systems have the ability to be conscious. This has led him to engage in the possibility of conscious thermostats, a view that aligns with panpsychism. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, panpsychism is defined as the view that mentality is fundamental and ubiquitous in the natural world. Essentially, everything that is material, no matter how small, has an element of individual consciousness. Panpsychism offers an appealing midway position between dualism and physicalism. Although physicalism provides a unified and uncomplicated depiction of the world, it potentially comes at the cost of an unsatisfactory account for the inception of human consciousness. On the other hand, dualism leaves us with a radically disunified picture of nature and the deep difficulty of understanding how mind and brain interact. Ultimately, panpsychism offers a potentially satisfying account of the human mind within a unified conception of nature. This worldview has a long history in Western and Eastern philosophical traditions. Panpsychism's popularity peaked during the 19th century, where it was widely accepted as the default theory in philosophy of mind. Its inevitable decline arrived during the mid-20th century, but the recent interest in the hard problem of consciousness has revived interest in it. All in all, we cannot define the subjective experience that is consciousness, and all questions of consciousness are tied to this sense of subjective experience. This leads Chalmers to raise the following questions. What is the relationship between consciousness and the physical universe? And can consciousness be explained in terms of the brain? Chalmers asserts that classical processes don't explain consciousness. This dilemma gives rise to his formulation of the hard problem of consciousness and his distinction between easy, cognitive problems and the hard, phenomenal problem. He went as far to distinguish the hard problem as the number one unanswered scientific challenge of our time during an appearance at the Australian Association of Philosophy. In his own words, how does the water of the brain turn into the wine of consciousness? Brains do not appear particularly remarkable, which makes the fact that they are even more exceptional. As scientist Lyle Watson once said, if the brain were so simple we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. For further reading, The Character of Consciousness, Constructing the World, Philosophy of Mind, Classical and Contemporary Readings. Patricia Churchland by Vikrant Chowdhury. Patricia Churchland was born on July 16, 1943, and was raised on a small farm in British Columbia. Even though her parents didn't have any education past middle school, they always were inclined towards science and imparted a secular worldview on Patricia. Despite the surrounding farming community chalking college up to be a waste of money, Patricia was pushed by her parents to attend college, and she graduated with honors from the University of British Columbia in 1965. She then continued on to study at Oxford as a graduate student studying philosophy. During her time at Oxford, she was immersed in a culture of what she describes as armchair philosophy. After her studies, she worked as an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba. However, by 1978, she had concluded that this conceptual analysis inherently ignored facts. She realized that neuroscience was necessary to study in order to come to empirically based philosophical conclusions. She began communicating with Dr. Baskerville Hyde, the head of the neuroanatomy department where she taught, and was encouraged to sit in on his lectures to further her theories. She soon looked to complete her training by focusing on neurophysiology and worked with Dr. Larry Jordan in his spinal cord laboratory. She then moved to San Diego to teach at USCD in 1984 due to the school's thriving neuroscience department and encouragement from her friend Francis Crick. With Crick, she formed a neuroscience group at Salk Institute, which was across the street from USCD. After fully exploring her theories, she released her first book named Neurophysiology, Toward a Unified Theory of the Mind-Brain in 1986. In the first part of the book, she gives an overview of neuroscience. In the second part, she expands on previous eliminative materialism arguments by providing the philosophy of science that supported such thinking. She also addressed arguments from anti-reductionists and dualists. Lastly, she delved into 3 theories of brain function. Her main intent of this book was to stress the importance of using empirical facts to analyze the philosophy of the mind. This book was meant as a way to introduce both sides, neuroscientists and philosophers, to the need to combine their work in order to come to a true model of how the brain can answer age-old philosophical questions. She believed that current neuroscience could explain the actual process of learning, the idea of self-control, and the nature of consciousness itself. Soon after, she began working with neuroscientist Terry Sejnowski to build a conceptual framework for how the brain works. In their joint book, The Computational Brain, they come to provide an overview of developments in the emerging field of computational neuroscience. In this book, they attempted to make a case for the need to analyze groups of neurons in order to understand brain function, rather than extrapolating all of brain function from a single neuron. They did this by demonstrating that their artificial neural network that was trained to handle difficult computational problems had similar patterns as those examined in real neuron groups. They also answered questions about how the mind represents visual stimulus, and they argue that the brain is essentially a computer that is chemical in nature. They suggested that in order to understand how the brain deals with inputs and creates outputs, we need to understand the structure of how neurons interact. Her work after this focused on consciousness, morality, and the sense of self. She argues that all of these principles can be understood after examining the brain's functioning and understanding evolutionary principles. She explores the implications of neuroscience on morality in her book Brain Trust: What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality. In this book, she explains that mammals at some point found it beneficial to develop an attachment to the offspring, while reptiles lay their eggs and continue on with their lives. She concluded that morality is the result of evolution and learned social behavior working together to shape our feelings about what is right or wrong. Patricia Churchland also explores in depth how evolutionary principles drives bonding and imitation. She then wrote Touching a Nerve: The Self as Brain, and exploring the implications of chemical impulses on our notion of pain and suffering. Her main argument is that understanding how your brain functions is central to having a better understanding of yourself. She also believes that you can appreciate brain biology as an explanation of human function without devaluing one's sense of self. Churchland is best known for advocating for the use of science to provide answers to basic philosophical questions. She blends many disciplinaries in order to make this larger argument and continues to advocate for the use of interdisciplinary works to come to these revelations. She believes that conscious experience can be reduced down to chemical interactions that are based on evolutionary principles. Her continual synthesis of many fields has helped push forward the field of neurophilosophy, and her background in philosophy has helped guide future endeavors along these lines. For future reading, Neurophilosophy, The Computational Brain, Consciousness: The Origins of Moral Intuition,